Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and could I welcome you all today to our meeting of the Public-Petitions-Committee. And as always, can I ask that everyone switches off their mobile phones because it interferes with our sound systems. We have apologies today from Adam Ingram, and Jim Eady will be attending as Adam Ingram's substitute. And we also have apologies today from Jackson Carlaw, who's unfortunately unwell today, so I hope he has a swift return. Could I also pass my own apologies that unfortunately at 10:30 I have another meeting to do with my members' bill which I have to attend, and that Chick Brodie, once he's arrived, will be chairing that. So apologies to the committee and indeed to the witnesses that I won't be around for the second tranche of evidence, but I will be back to the committee as quickly as I can. So agenda item 1 is decision on taking item in private. The first item of business seeks the committee's agreement to take item 4 in private. Is the committee agreed that this item should be taken in private? Agreed. Thank you. So agenda item 2, tackling child sexual exploitation in Scotland. The next item of business is evidence as part of our inquiry into tackling child sexual exploitation in Scotland. We will hear from 2 panels of witnesses today. And can I just put on record my thanks for the extremely experienced group of witnesses that we've got before us today in the next 2 sessions. I know all of you are very, very busy people, but it really does help our inquiry when we've got very senior people and people with very excellent first-hand experience. So again, just can I thank you all for giving up your time to appear before our committee. So if I start by welcoming the first panel, Daljit Dagan, our Children's Services Manager from Bernard, Scotland, who we've met a number of times before and actually showed us around the project in Glasgow. So thank you again for your help. Julian Heng is the Service Manager for NHS Open Road. Liz Ray, the National Learning and Development Lead for Who Cares Scotland, and Martin Henry is the National Manager Stop It Now Scotland. So the format today is a series of questions and points from the committee, and I'll start off with a number of questions, and then I'll invite my colleagues to raise various questions and points. Even though the questions might be directed at one of the panel, I could just invite the panel to say please feel free to raise any points or additional information that you have, because we're really here today to learn from you, from your experience, to make sure that our inquiry is as professional as possible when it comes to writing up, which will probably be the tail end of the year. If I start my question to Daljit Dagan, could you give the committee some practical examples of how your project has worked with and collected evidence from police officers, young people and other agencies to identify and disrupt perpetrators of CSE?
I mean, obviously, as a committee will be aware, I manage a street-based service, so we come into contact primarily with young people who we make contact with in the street. So as well as also kind of observing a lot of activity on the streets, we also get information from young people. So we actually observe perpetrators or potential perpetrators in terms of being based in the hotspots that young people are around. So that's information that we share with the police on a daily, nightly basis. We also have provided the police very recently with a kind of victim association map that we kind of put together as a service, where we identified young people who were all kind of connected to one another, but also some of the adult perpetrators that they had also identified to us. And the police were actually able to undertake some checks, both in relation to the victims, but also in terms of the perpetrators. Some of the young people are also would identify themselves as conduits, or we would identify them as conduits, and it's young people, for instance, who are maybe still involved in sexual exploitation or have previously been involved in exploitation, and they are then requested by adults to then try to introduce other young people. So again, that kind of information that we share on a regular basis with the police. We have also kind of spoke to the police about the possibility of issuing harbour notices, information on abduction as well, and looking at all the different kind of disruption techniques that they can utilise as well in relation to being able to identify where young people hang out, where potential perpetrators might also be hanging about, and some of the other techniques that they can use to, as I suppose, just gather intelligence on people before they act on that information. So it's very much about trying to put different pieces of the one jigsaw together and making sure that all the agencies are kind of communicating that information, because individually we all have that information from young people, but collectively we'll also have that information. The other thing that we've also been quite influential in is basically in Renfrewshire, where we have managed to persuade the police and social work to pull together what we call a kind of victim, offender and location kind of working group. It's an operational group and it meets every 4 weeks, where we identify victims of sexual exploitation and also identify perpetrators as well, so that we've got a plan of intervention for both perpetrators and for victims that's happening in parallel.
Thank you. I mean, one of the points I was thinking about earlier on, looking at inquiries throughout the UK that have happened, for example, following the tragic death of a young person. My own experience, as you know, working in the front line of social work, was that you looked at these major inquiries, and the inquiries had the same sort of recommendations, such as better coordination, among agencies. Time and time again, this seemed to happen. Is that still your experience? Clearly, I'm out of date in terms of day-to-day practice. Is it still your experience as an issue of coordination among the agencies that are involved in CSE in Scotland? I
think it's about coordination, it's about communication and information sharing as well. But I think one of the most significant issues in relation to CSE in Scotland is that the vast majority of children that are on the Child Protection Register tend to be under the age of 12, and they're only over the age of 12 if they're part of a larger sibling group. So CSE doesn't tend to be captured through the Child Protection Registration. In Glasgow, as you quite rightly pointed, we had a young person who died, a young person who we all knew was involved in sexual exploitation, we all knew was accommodated, and we all knew was involved in drugs and alcohol. And as soon as she came out of a kind of secure setting, she died within 7 days. And that's when Glasgow kind of pulled together. We had obviously an inquiry, but what we established was the kind of vulnerable young persons procedures that's still operating in the city 12 years on, and that's very much about identifying the kind of risky behaviours that young people engage in, and rather than penalising them for it, recognising that that's what some young people do become involved in some of these behaviours, like for instance, kind of having lengthy patterns of going missing, involvement in sexual exploitation, just being 2 of those behaviours. And it was about having a similar plan to the kind of child protection plan, so that we had a kind of case conference style management plan and a core plan, so that there was agencies that were kind of coordinating a kind of care plan and a risk management plan for that young person as well. So although we have that in Glasgow, and it works as well as it can, it still has its faults in that a lot of police, for instance, won't regularly attend those meetings. Do you know what I mean? And they're a key component of that kind of risk management plan. So there are still lessons that can be learned. But like I said, Glasgow's the only local authority in the whole of Scotland that actually has that plan, where we're able to capture the 12 pluses.
Well, you've just predicted my sort of next question, which was the good practice which I saw sort of firsthand and the committee saw firsthand. Is clearly identifiable with Glasgow. I mean, why shouldn't we have these techniques drawn out for the whole of Scotland? And if that is the case, who's responsible for doing that? Who's responsible to say this best practice should be developed throughout the whole of Scotland?
I mean, I think certainly from a Bernardo's perspective, we were hopeful that as part of the refresh in terms of the National Child Protection Guidance, that's something that could have been picked up there. And we were also hopeful that what we could have also had is some kind of good practice guidance for practitioners across Scotland, where we were able to identify what some of the key indicators and risk factors are, and also what some of the strategies could be put in place in terms of trying to reduce and minimise young people's involvement in sexual exploitation.
Do other panel members wish to contribute at this stage? Yes, Martin.
I'd like to say something to you, if I may. It's just moving on from something that Daljeet referred to in your last question there, about making a consistent approach across Scotland to being more proactive in how we deal with the matters of child sexual exploitation. It's just a small issue. And it's with a different hat on as the previous chair of the Scottish Coalition for Young Runaways. I was heavily involved in the conduct of the pilot of return home interviews for young runaways in the Grampian area and the follow-up of that within Grampian Police. And the outcome of that evaluation was very clear, that conducting an interview with a young person who's been returned after a period of having run away is actually a really good thing to do, not just to ensure the welfare of that young person, but critically, from the police's point of view, to obtain, if possible, some kind of intelligence around what the experience of that young person has been during the period that they ran away. And that might also include experience of child sexual exploitation and other types of behaviour. The recommendation from that evaluation was that return home interviews of young people who have run away should be rolled out across Scotland. That didn't happen, and it didn't happen for a multitude of reasons, one of which I understand was probably financial. And it seems to me that in answer to your last question, a good way of actually starting to get a more consistent approach in a small way is perhaps to revisit that issue of ensuring that if we're taking an intelligence-led approach to this, to try and prevent child sexual exploitation, then perhaps engaging with young people who have run away and who have a pattern of running away in a more meaningful way might help us to do so.
Right, thank you very much. That's very helpful. Do other panellists wish to contribute at this stage? Okay.
The only thing I kind of wanted to say was that I was kind of chatting to the panel members earlier on, and certainly people will be aware that in Glasgow we've had the Operation Cotswold, and there was significant learning in relation to Operation Cotswold, particularly for the police. And I am pleased to kind of share with you that the police have kind of, in terms of conducting future operations, what they have done is kind of developed a kind of victim strategy as well as a perpetrator strategy. You know, so recognising that we have to be prepared for young people disclosing, and we also have to be prepared to take action when they do tell us information. So, I mean, as well as the kind of information that comes from return interviews, I think certainly the police in the west of Scotland are certainly developing better measures in which to be proactive in terms of I suppose being able to respond better to children who are identifying sexual exploitation as an issue.
The police will be giving evidence, I think, in 2 weeks today, but I would have thought that the best practice we perhaps see in Strathclyde would probably be echoed throughout the whole of Scotland, in that we've got now a single police force. But I know that's a question for them, but I think it might be useful just to flag that one up. Again, a question that's probably best answered by the police and the prosecution services, but is why the 2005 Prevention of Sexual Offences Act has led to, I think, one conviction. I know it's perhaps a question direct for them, but I would be grateful for the views of the panellists on that particular issue, because clearly when that was put through, the idea was this was breaking new ground, but one conviction doesn't seem to me to be breaking new ground. But who wants to answer that?
I mean, I suppose for me, it's quite clear-cut, and it's not just specific to the police, but there is a general lack of understanding and awareness of what CSE is. So we have to get better in terms of being able to identify the issue, to be able to respond to the issue in terms of supporting young people, and to be able to identify techniques in which we can disrupt and prosecute perpetrators. For too long, the focus has been in prosecution, where we kind of basically kind of place the kind of victim at the central part of that. So all the information has to come from the victim. Now, we all know that victims generally don't see themselves as being victims, and they see themselves as being in a consensual relationship with that adult perpetrator. So that, from I suppose, the kind of perspective of the actual scrutinising the legislation, I think that for me there's two issues. It's about the lack of recognition and awareness that CSE exists, and how we identify it. But secondly, I've also had police officers on the ground tell me that they weren't aware of the powers that they had as part of that legislation as well. So that there has to be a better awareness raising for police officers as well, in terms of what techniques they can use to disrupt and prosecute.
Yeah, that is quite worrying when police officers saying they weren't aware of these powers. But so, I mean, again, that's a question perhaps for 2 weeks' time, but certainly one I think it's useful to make a note of at this stage. I think, John Wilson, you wish to come in.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Daljeet, just as a follow-on from the Convener's question about the number of prosecutions under the current legislation, you indicated, and I may have picked you up wrongly, but you indicated that the police were prepared to proceed with prosecution rather than other measures to try and deter potential offences. But given that we've only had one of the person prosecuted under the legislation, then do you think the police are doing enough to prosecute under the legislation and send out a signal, or do you feel the police have been lax? And you've made a comment about some police officers not being aware of their powers under the legislation, but clearly what we're seeing is that the number of prosecutions does not give confidence the police are actually, or the Procurator Fiscal's office, are taking this issue serious enough to actually deal with the perpetrators.
I mean, I think for me the issue is if we rely heavily on victims' testimonies, most victims will not identify themselves as being a victim, and I can't stress that enough. But certainly the best experiences I've had of young people being able to to kind of look back is when they're like 16 plus. And if you look at the risk of sexual harm orders in particular that are part of the legislation, the 2005 legislation, they're only for young people up to the age of 15 and a half. Do you know what I mean? So once you hit 16, that order bears no resemblance in terms of being able to prosecute a perpetrator. So that's something. So in terms of looking at that legislation, it's about checking whether it is robust enough. And I think certainly from conversations with the police, I know that they've identified that agencies don't seem to, and by agencies, that they're talking primarily about statutory agencies, very rarely have a coordinated approach when it comes to 16, 17-year-olds who are not on any kind of supervision order and are technically seen as adults and therefore, engaging in this activity on a voluntary basis.
Thank you.
If I just might add something. I think that certainly my view would be that one of the things we perhaps need to do is to strengthen the harbouring legislation within the Children Act, and I know that was part of the written submission that I put in around that issue. If my memory serves me right, it's section 83. And I think that the business about that isn't so much about taking an enforcement-led approach, because I actually think, as you would expect me to say, prevention is better than cure. But I do think that by enforcing legislation like the harbouring legislation, it sends out a very clear signal to adults who may behave in a particular way that the authorities are very serious about following that up. So for me, it's not just about the statistics of prosecution or investigation. It's about the message that it sends out to adults that if they want to behave in a particular way in relation to a particular young person or groups of young people, that will be taken very seriously and followed through by the authorities. But I think strengthening the harbouring legislation is one way to approach that.
Give that, Chip Brodie.
Thank you. Firstly, my apologies for being a few minutes late. Daljit, just coming back to what you said about having a plan in Glasgow, and yet as I heard, the police don't attend the meetings. I mean, what involvement of all the component parts of the organisations required? What part did the police particularly play in that? And how are these plans measured, monitored, recorded?
I mean, certainly in Glasgow, the vulnerable young persons procedures follow the format of child protection procedures. So you have a case discussion to determine whether, and it's a multi-agency case discussion to try and determine whether this young person should be, their care plan should be formalised under these procedures. And when it goes from case discussion, so that's very much about providing the evidence, and then it's about going to case conference, and then what you do is then establish a kind of core group of people who will then coordinate that care plan for a young person.
No, I understand that. The overall plan.
Yeah, in terms of
the creation of this plan.
Sorry?
In the creation of the overall plan. I mean, I know there will be differences, and you have to review these. But how much of a role did the police play in the creation of that plan? Very
little. I mean, I think I suppose they've kind of missed an opportunity, because traditionally when the police come along, it's very much about providing information in relation to that child's criminality, rather than thinking about, what adult perpetrators is this child involved in, and how can we better think about disrupting that activity. So from my point of view, I think that's a trick that's been missed, and that's a clear role that police should have in any of those meetings, rather than the focus being on what the child's up to. And how we can minimise that, because I think that there's other professionals there who can support that plan, and the police should have a very particular plan around looking at disrupting some of that activity, and that should be based on the information that's provided by the child in terms of the areas they're hanging about with, who they're hanging about with, what information and observations they've kind of shared with staff, and looking at, just as Martin said, are there other techniques that we can use, like harbouring notices. I mean, I know that in Glasgow, for instance, currently the police are in consultation with legal services around how far they can go with harbouring notices, looking at abduction, because lots of young there's been lots of information about young people being held against their will in flats. I mean, there's been lots of media attention recently around party flats in particular, which I'm sure that the whole committee would have recognised. But I think if the police could have a focused approach in terms of looking at how they disrupt activity, rather than the actual criminal behaviours of the child, would be, I think, certainly helpful.
If I may, I understand that, but again, that's, if you like, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but that's reactive. I'm talking about you're asking for a national strategy, which is commendable, and we have a new regime in terms of Police Scotland. I'm struggling to find out where they actually participate in creating, or could participate in creating this overall and this overarching national strategy.
I mean, certainly every Child Protection Committee should have a police representation, and that's where the kind of local strategies are developed in terms of every community planning partnership area as well as Child Protection Committee areas. But in response to your question, where are the police in terms of a proactive level? Probably not there. And I think that's primarily because child sexual exploitation hasn't been seen as a child protection issue, and therefore we haven't had the response from the police that we would have expected in terms of in terms of being proactive.
Thank you for that. My next question is for Gillian Hing and Martin Hendry, but obviously any other panellists feel free to come in. As you'll be aware, the situation for males facing CSE has generally received less attention than girls. Could you help the committee understand what you found the main difficulties in tackling the problem for both boys and young men?
I think for a considerable length of time, the issue of men who are experiencing a whole range of abuse issues has often been somewhat invisible. I think there could be certainly multiple reasons for that. I think often for ourselves at NHS Open Road, where we're predominantly working with adult males who will then go into disclose that they have experienced childhood sexual abuse and have been groomed and exploited into prostitution at an age before 18. They will often disclose that they did not feel comfortable making those disclosures until much later into their 20s. So in terms of our experience of working with males, we do often find that we have a core cluster of clients who are in their late 20s and through into their 30s, because that will be the age before that they felt comfortable to actually approach services, disclose the experiences that they've had, and then ask for the support round about that. We will sometimes work with under 18s, but certainly the vast majority of our clients, while over 18, will disclose to us the fact that their experience started long before they were 18. So certainly one of the key issues for the boys and the men involved is that delay in being able to overcome the stigma and actually approach a service and disclose their experience. I think also because much of the abuse is perpetrated by males, for a lot of the men who are accessing our service, there is an additional layer of, I suppose it's an additional stigma, that as well as the stigma of experiencing sexual exploitation, there's also a stigma attached to the perception, be it real or false, that they themselves are gay or bisexual, and that there's a homophobic stigma, which is also a barrier to people attending service. So I think there's multiple things going on there which reduce the person's confidence in being able to approach a service. And I think that's why so much of our work has actually been focused on working with other service providers to help them create the context and the environment that when somebody approaches their service, they will feel comfortable and confident to disclose that information, in terms of giving some kind of signal that as a worker, we're aware of the stigma, but we're not going to be startled by those disclosures, and it is actually safe to say it's okay to tell us what those experiences are. So I think there's quite a lot going on there.
Yeah, Martin?
Yes, I don't really have very much to add to that, except perhaps to say that, as you would expect, I see child sexual exploitation very much as only one manifestation of child sexual abuse. I mean, it's part of a much wider picture, and I think we've got to continually hold on to that. The child sexual abuse, exploitation isn't some kind of distinct set of behaviours. It really falls under the umbrella of what we've always understood to be a range of behaviours known as child sexual abuse. Having said that, we know from the research, and we know from our clinical experience and the services of agencies, that boys respond to that treatment and these types of experiences in a very different way to girls, and face, as we've already heard, a number of barriers in relation to how they disclose or discuss or articulate these experiences. So it's no surprise that then that when you look at the report figures, that girls tend to feature more prominently than boys in reporting child sexual abuse. I think one of the issues, other than the barriers that boys face, which we've already heard about, which are around stigma, about how you'll be perceived, about your own efficacy as a man, about not actually understanding what's happening to you as abusive, because when you see it as part of a grooming relationship, I think it's quite difficult for young people, and particularly also for boys, to see that as in any way harmful to them when it's seen in the context of a relationship that has benefits for them. And I think we've got to understand the complexity of that for victims. I think one of the outstanding issues for me, though, also is the attitude of professionals, because I think unless professionals are prepared to see the likelihood that boys are vulnerable as a distinct and real possibility, then a lot of boys and young men are going to remain invisible.
Thank you very much for that. Do other panellists wish to contribute at this stage?
I just wanted to kind of pick up on one of Julian's points, and I think that's the whole thing, the whole stigma of homophobia. And I think certainly a lot of agencies will see boys' experimentation in child sexual exploitation as being exploring their sexuality when it's anything but. So I think it's about having to change the way helping agencies basically try and respond to boys, because often they see the sexual activity rather than the abusive activity as being the main theme.
Thank you for that.
Finish off what was my train of thought there. I think one of the issues for me is about how we prevent young men becoming potential victims, for want of a better word, of child sexual exploitation, particularly, but also more widely, child sexual abuse. So it seems to me that if we're going to be successful in any strategy to prevent, we need to see young men as a particular target group and start to frame our messages around how young men understand this issue, and not just do it in a very general way, which is often predicated on a model that's more effective for girls and women than it is for men. So I think if we're going to start to prevent it more successfully, we really need to start to think more smartly about how young men understand these messages and tailor our messages accordingly.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sorry, slightly conscious of time here, so I'll maybe move around to my colleagues. The next question is for Liz Ray, and it's from Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Convener. My question is in relation to young people who are looked after in residential settings. Who Cares Scotland highlighted in their evidence that there are a number of young people who rebel against the restrictions that are placed on them in residential units, who perhaps run away and then spend time with people who are unsafe and who go on to abuse them or to expose them to exploitation. My question then is, how do we design residential settings in a way that they're welcoming and appealing to those young people, given that you will always have to have boundaries and restrictions in place?
That's a really difficult question, I have to be honest. I think most of the residential settings I have found myself in have been welcoming, have been supportive to young people. I think young people's prior experiences have an impact on whether they can actually take support from within units and for the staff that are there. Relationships are offered. I mean, I think one of the points made in my first submission was from a young person who said he really struggled to accept love and support and care from the staff in the unit, as did other young people, and it was easier to be elsewhere because caring about people is really scary. When you engage with other people and you give a wee bit of yourself, potentially in his mind it made him vulnerable. I think there's something about relationships. I think we need to build on developing the relationships within the residential setting rather than young people developing what they believe are caring relationships out with. It's how we transfer that, because every young person I've spoken to, and I spoke to a number of young people in preparation for this submission, spoke about needing to fit in, feeling they didn't fit in within the residential setting because it wasn't their home, it wasn't their people. Quite often it wasn't even the area that they came from. And they looked to find like-minded people in the community. And even though they were probably less safe and knew they were less safe, they fitted in, they weren't judged, they weren't expected to comply with rules and regulations they didn't understand or didn't agree with. I think it's very complex, and I don't think it's about the settings themselves. I think it's about relationships and about people and staff training, staff awareness and understanding. So that's a bit of a long answer, but I hope it's helpful.
Any of the other panel have any thoughts or perspectives you'd like to add?
I just want to say that it's just recognising that when young people are accommodated, usually for the first time, they're obviously extremely distressed at having to leave their families. And when they move into a setting, be it a foster care setting, be it a residential you know, children's unit, it doesn't matter what the setting is, that placement becomes part of the problem for them. Do you know what I mean? So it's quite hard for them to start to begin to have a relationship and have a trusting relationship with people they actually blame for having them there in the first place.
I absolutely agree. I think that the other problem is that we have to remember that young people who are accommodated within the care system don't come into that without baggage. They're coming with a whole history of experiences that sometimes, as we've heard, don't equip them to be able to accept care and support, particularly planned and structured care and support, including discipline and boundaries, in a way that's very receptive. And very often some of these young people are going to much more prefer to be with people where there are no boundaries, no expectation, and what they think is total acceptance of them as a person. Well, we know that it's not total acceptance, it's at a price, but the young person reads these messages in that particular way. So I think the complexity for me isn't so much just about how residential services deliver what they offer. It's also tailoring it in a way to what we understand to be the complex needs of young people coming into the care system. And I think sometimes we don't get that as right as perhaps we should.
Thank you. John Wilson.
Thank you. My question is a follow-up to that one from Jim Eadie, and it's really about the people who find themselves in residential care, and there's been some criticism of the failure of staff to properly monitor the children that are in their care, and the fact that we've heard previous evidence that young people can disappear for anything up to 2 to 4 hours without actually being reported to the authorities. Are there any measures that you're aware of that the staff are taking in these residential care units to ensure that they're monitoring who the young people may be meeting with, what cars may be coming to regularly pick them up, to take them away, and what measures are in place in relation to the longer term? Because we talk about absconding, and it's a general term that's used, but we don't normally apply absconding to young people who go away for 2 to 4 hours if they come back. How do residential care units actually ensure that we're actually fully protecting those young people when they are supposed to be there, and ensuring that if there are any unusual or suspicious activities taking place, that that's properly being recorded, reported and dealt with?
Quite often, regularly in residential units, young people have free time. They go out with their friends at night, at weekends, they go to visit family, they're allowed to be in the community depending on the type of order that they're on. Provided there has been no particular issue raised in the past, young people are able to come and go at will, and I think that has to be reasonable for for the majority of young people. It's interesting that the bulk of the advocacy that we have provided for young people who have been involved in being sexually exploited has actually come as a result of staff trying to put in place boundaries and trying to put in place systems to protect young people. So removal of mobile phones, grounding young people, taking control of their pocket money so they can't buy alcohol or can't physically maybe get buses or taxis to wherever these people happen to be. I think there have been a lot of steps taken, but I think it's difficult because young people themselves cover it up. Young people protect the people who exploit them in many cases, and I think it's an uphill battle for staff. I think they tend to be very proactive where they can be, but it's made difficult by the fact that young people are entitled to be in the community, they're entitled to have friends, and until you've actually got proof that they're doing something or something's been done to them that's untoward, there's no any real reason to limit their time.
Convener, the issue, and I'm not saying this is a general assertion, I'm just saying that the residential units themselves can become targets by predators. And it's how we ensure that when we have young people in residential units, they are protected, particularly if they're in residential units, as you explained earlier, that are not within their hometown or their own region. That they may be in a residential care unit that is out with their known areas of where they normally hang about. And it's how do we make sure that where there could potentially be predators preying on young people in these residential units, that appropriate action is being taken to deal with the predators, because we can protect young people and we should be protecting young people, but it's how do we protect them against potential predators who target particular vulnerable young people in areas where they know they're vulnerable, and that residential units are one of these areas.
I think certainly a couple of the issues that we have dealt with have related to people turning up in cars to pick young people up late at night, or and they communicate with young people through Facebook, through online sites. I mean, it's a nightmare to even contemplate how you would manage that. But very often they don't meet close to the unit. The young person just disappears, and the staff don't know. They've disappeared at the unit. The staff don't know where they've gone. They're clever enough that they don't necessarily turn up at the door. I mean, we've had experiences in the past where staff have phoned the police because they know that somebody's in the area. But again, these people cover their tracks really well when it comes to the residential settings, because they're easy, it would be easy to identify if they were in the too prominent in the vicinity of the unit.
Supplementary to this, Ray, do you believe that residential staff underuse the powers they have, or is your argument that we need to have new powers?
I don't think they underuse the powers they have. I think they're very limited, because if they're too punitive, young people have got rights, and young people obviously will contact organisations such as ourselves to challenge the fact that, for example, staff are keeping them in the unit. That's fine for a night or two, but we've worked with young people who've been kept in for maybe 3 weeks solid. They're not in any kind of place safety warrant, they're no secured, so we have to advocate that they be allowed some time in the community. I think the powers potentially need to be different, but also I think staff need to understand the issues that they're dealing with. I think a lot of staff take the view that young people are making choices and decisions to behave in the way that they are. And I don't think it's seen as being very often as being exploited, the children being exploited. I think they're seen as behaving riskily. I think they're seen as just generally viewed as absconders quite often. They're viewed as absconders, they're viewed as young people who make risky decisions, hang about with dodgy people, and the issue becomes the young person's issue rather than the issue of the perpetrators that are involved with them.
To that, and can I now move on to general questions for panel discussion? It's Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. There's been quite a bit of discussion in the evidence we've received to date about definitions of child sexual exploitation. Do you feel these currently help or hinder efforts to protect young people? And do you think it's helpful to distinguish CSE from childhood sexual abuse in general?
Who wants to kick off?
Yeah, I may as well warm everybody up. The answer to the last part of your question is no, I don't think it's distinct from child sexual abuse. I mean, I think that there are a number of different manifestations of that type of behaviour. And we know increasingly that it's not only adults who behave in a particularly abusive way towards young people or children. Some children and young people also behave in that way. So it's a complex picture. From a preventative point of view, I think it is dangerous if we start to separate off child sexual abuse, sexual exploitation too much from the wider child sexual abuse agenda. Having said that, I think it's absolutely right strategically that we start to pay attention to the particular form that child sexual exploitation takes and the complexities around that, which we've heard about today, which aren't just around how young people behave, but to be fair, are actually also around how adults behave. So I think from my point of view, preventatively speaking, our challenge in Scotland is to start to change the thinking and the behaviour of adults, as well as to start to influence the behaviour of young people. And that's an issue for me that's a challenge that applies right across the sexual abuse agenda, not just particular to child sexual exploitation. But I do think that it's a very serious challenge that we have to resist the temptation to put the burden of responsibility for their own protection on children and young people themselves. That responsibility lies with adults, and that's why it's important to change the thinking and behaviour of the adult population.
And I suppose in recognition of the fact that it was Barnardo's that kind of raised the petition, and I suppose the fact that we've had obviously lots of information in relation to the Jimmy Savile inquiry in particular has kind of obviously sharpened the focus in relation to child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation. And I certainly, in terms of our organisation, our focus has never been about one or the other. It's recognising that child sexual exploitation is different in the sense that it tends to be non-familial people who are involved in the abuse and exploitation of the child. So I think that from Bernard's perspective, we have felt that child sexual exploitation has been under the radar for too long, and certainly in terms of definitions, the first definition I ever came across was in 1992, which was a very basic definition, and if you look over the last 20 years, and certainly in terms of the inquiries that we've had down south, it highlights the kind of complexity of the issue in terms of all the different ways in which young people can become involved and are becoming involved, and also the different techniques that perpetrators are utilising to be able to, I suppose, prevent prosecution. So I think, you know, in terms of recognising that, that we do have to focus on the perpetrators. I mean, like, certainly in past training, I've mentioned to people that Bernardo's had developed the kind of triangles where the focus was always on the victim, but in recognition that we also had a child sex offender and we also had a facilitator in relation to that child sexual offence. But we have to flip that triangle over, and the focus needs to be on how we disrupt and prosecute those perpetrators, but also identify some of those locations so that we're policing those locations better, so as to protect and prevent young people from becoming involved in child sexual exploitation. But the only way that we can do that is by having a national strategy that looks at all the different elements in terms of being able to identify the issues and being able to provide the support where required.
I think, John Wilson, you had a supplementary.
Yeah, just in terms of the comments about identifying where police may suspect that sexual predators may be actively engaged. And I remember a number of years ago, I used to drive through Glasgow on a Saturday afternoon, and there's what I understood as the term for young people used was the unders clubs. And I was really surprised at the number of young males that were in cars hanging about outside talking to young females. And I was rather concerned in terms of the situation that we're now here in terms of the situation in Rochdale, Oxford and other areas down south, that we haven't heard similar situations happening in Scotland in relation to this, and we will investigate further the police. But it's the issue about trying to ensure that we make sure that we tackle every area where child sexual exploitation may take place, and that may also be in terms of the familial situation, where we know that for many decades there's a lot of hidden sexual exploitation taking place within the family unit or the close family unit. And we regularly hear of cases where a family member has been brought to justice because of the actions that they've been involved in with other family members. But it's how do we make sure that when we're dealing with this issue, that we capture all the areas where this sexual exploitation may be taking place and not lose sight by focusing in one area and actually losing some traction or some oversight in other areas where this abuse may be taking place.
What I would be saying is we need to have a national strategy where we identify the full spectrum of support that's required, and you have somebody monitoring each and every one of those activities. You know, so you have an action plan for each of those activities, be it, I suppose, whether it's in relation to raising awareness for parents or residential workers or young people themselves or general community. You have a strategy in terms of disruption, you have a strategy in terms of making sure that we provide the appropriate support to young people, both in terms of prevention and intervention, and also in terms of recovery as well, in terms of what happens to young people once they have made that disclosure. Do you know what I mean? What happens next? Because 9 times out of 10, they still stay in the same accommodation. They still have the same networks of support. Do you know what I mean? We have to break some of those networks. So I suppose in response to that, it would be about having a national strategy that's coordinated on every single level, so that we are, and there will be priorities kind of within that, but if we have somebody who's overseeing the activities happening under each of those banners, I think that would be a start.
I'm afraid I'm very short of time, so we've got one question left from Amit Taggart, and Chip Brody's got one brief point first.
Yeah, can I just very briefly? You were talking about national strategy. How much contact have you had internationally? Because this is not just a Scottish problem.
Internationally, in terms of with agencies or with young people?
Those that are involved in trying to address this problem.
Yeah, well, certainly in terms of Bernardo's, we've been involved in the Daphne project over the years, which is a European-funded research programme, and we were able to link with services based in the Netherlands and also Estonia over the last 10 years, and that was very much about looking at practice in terms of, both in terms of research, but also in terms of practice, so that we were developing our practice and sharing our practice, so as to make sure that any support that we were offering young people was the best it could be.
What are the most important ways in which the statutory sector and the criminal justice system in Scotland now need to work collaboratively with the voluntary sector in combating CSE? Could you give any concrete examples?
If I could just say that in a very general way in response to your question, my feel for it is that now that we've got thinking of, for example, law enforcement, now that we've got a single police service for the whole of Scotland, it seems to me that there may be aspects of what the police have traditionally done that the voluntary sector might be able to do, both cheaper and potentially more effectively, and to free up police time to be focused in other areas. For example, the return home interview issue that I was talking about earlier on, it might be that intelligence gathering exercise, if you want to call it that, could actually be undertaken by voluntary sector agencies in an effective way. And I know that that's definitely part of the pilots. So that's one very practical example of what traditionally would be seen as a police activity, but actually could effectively be done by the voluntary sector. And I think there are probably plenty more of them, to be fair, particularly from a prevention point of view. I resist the idea, though, from a criminal justice perspective, I resist the idea that we need to put all of our eggs in the basket of enforcement. I really do feel very strongly that there's a very important prevention agenda here that's about improving people's understanding of an issue and improving their capacity and resilience to be able to behave differently or respond differently. So I do appreciate the idea that we need to put some efforts into finding perpetrators and dealing with it after it's come to it's surfaced, but I don't think any strategy is worth its weight unless we actually balance that out with a good approach to prevention as well. Thank you for that. Do other panellists wish to add any contribution?
I suppose from my perspective, I think there has to be a cultural shift, because if I give you an example, it's the best way to describe it. When I had mentioned to you that we had shared information with the police, with the Police Scotland, it was Strathclyde Police because it was prior to April. We gave them information on 30 victims and 10 perpetrators, and from that they went away and did whatever. And they then pulled together a core group of people to talk about a victim strategy and start progressing interviews. Now, I was invited to the meeting yesterday, and that had been the 4th meeting that had taken place. And what I got was, really sorry, Daljeet, that we never invited you. We forgot, even though we were the ones that gave them the information to start with. And already sitting there was social work, health and education. So there has to be a cultural shift in terms of valuing the work that the voluntary sector do and the key role that we play, both in terms of having the information to begin with, but also in terms of the relationships that we have with families and children. And the second point that I would like to make is, certainly as somebody who's got a social work background, I remember in my 3 years of training, I only ever had one day where we actually worked with professionals who were training to be youth workers, for instance, in our whole 3 years. And I think as workers, as students, as you're going through your social work training or your health training or your police training, I think professionals need to come together while they're still students and look at how they actually start to work together before they're even in their respective fields. So I think that's something that we can certainly be looking at as well.
Do other panellists wish to contribute?
I was just going to say, to mirror the points that Daljeet has already made, and just to reaffirm that position, that in terms of the potential benefit of a national strategy, that it would afford an opportunity to coordinate the various different stakeholders who would be involved within that strategy, and that it would also afford us that opportunity to accurately frame the experience of child sexual exploitation and have that common understanding across all the stakeholders who would be acting upon the strategy, and thinking about how that would have the knock-on effect in terms of prevention, identification and support, and with regards to the question round about what could statutory agencies do, and statutory agencies could be doing more routine inquiry, but to do that routine inquiry and to create that culture, we would need that common understanding and that accurate framing, because that will then dictate the culture that we're trying to create and the particular inquiry that we're trying to make routine. And I think a lot of those benefits could stem from something such as a national strategy where you have that opportunity, as I say, for coordination and cooperation.
Do you wish to add any quick points?
If I could, I totally agree with the comments of my colleagues, but I'd also like to make the point that we need to really need to raise awareness within the public of what child sexual exploitation is. I think many staff don't know what child sexual exploitation is. They see it as behaviour of children. If people who've been trained don't understand it, how can we expect the public to understand it? I think particularly in terms of looked after children, there's a massive stigma about being looked after, and that stigma is magnified if you're a looked after young person who also is being sexually exploited in the community. The public potentially could safeguard young people if they were aware of the issues, and I think quite often they're oblivious.
Thank you all very much for your evidence. Sorry we're having to cut it short. We could have continued for another hour or two, but your experience is invaluable in helping us have some judgments about what needs to be recommended in the future. So thank you very much again for coming along and answering the questions so helpfully. You're obviously very welcome to stay, but I know you're all busy people and I'm sure you've got other things to do. But if you wish to stay, please feel free to sit in the gallery, and I'll suspend for 2 minutes to allow our witnesses to change over. Thank you again.
Well, this is the part of the second item on the agenda. I apologise, Mr. Stewart has left us briefly. Can I welcome Kinder Barr from Aberlour Child Care Trust, Rosina McRae from Say Women, Linda Thompson from Women's Sport Project, and Anela Anwar, Head of Projects at Roshni. You're very welcome. We will follow the same procedure as we had with the first panel, in that we will ask a few questions which will be possibly addressed to individual members of the panel. And when that person has finished answering, we will ask if anyone else wishes to add something to that answer. And then at the end, we'll finish with a couple of general questions for all members of the panel. So if I may, with the privilege of convener, open the session by asking the first question, which I really address to Mr. Dunbar, in having read your very interesting submission. Each year in Scotland, a number of numerous young children and young people run away, meeting in the course of that event some dangerous people and in dangerous situations which they again may encounter when they are returned home. Aberlour has been at the front of campaigning for young people's refuges, and indeed you have your own. It's, however, small, and local authorities have failed to take up the options they have to establish refuges for children under the age of 16. In your view, in your opinion, why do you think this is? What attitudes militate still against setting up refuges, and how might more successful pressures be exerted, in your opinion, to establish more safe places?
Chair, a very interesting question in relation to refuge. It's one of our greatest challenges to get the optimum use of our refuge when we know fine well that there's a large number of children and young people who will run away from home. And over the years, we've tried to work with the local authorities, with all agencies, including the police, to make the whole system, and that's not just the refuge, but the whole system in terms of engagement with the young people, return home welfare interviews, and the whole process of trying to look after the child right. I don't think there's been a big enough appreciation of the importance of a refuge and a intense period of support for children who have been pushed into a runaway situation. One of the things that we're proposing essentially is to make it a duty on local authorities to provide refuge as part of the Children and Young People's Bill, which we believe will make a huge difference to the way that this will work, because currently there's a power, it hasn't been taken up, and essentially we believe there should be a duty, and that may well change the way that local authorities and other agencies that are involved might support it. But so far, it has been a struggle. But of course, the cases that we do deal with, many of which I have to say are quite horrific cases, we can see the need and the appropriate the value of a service like that.
Thank you. I'm just a small supplementary, and then I'll bring in John Wilson, who also wants to ask a question on that. These situations are not just statistics, but I just wonder what analysis is done as to the reasons that children run away. I mean, is it a whole series of reasons, or can you focus on one or two? I mean, do you do that sort of, yes, counselling feedback?
Yes, we do, Chair. We more recently, particularly in order to get down to a detailed level of understanding why we're not getting use of the refuge, because, as I say, it's been a struggle. We looked at the cases that are coming in. We've also looked at the cases where contact has been made, but the referral hasn't followed through. So we can start to understand the reasons why people are not pursuing or using the refuge as a place of safety, so to speak. And that, but the range of things are clearly sexual abuse, And if we take that on the basis of the earlier points,
can you
absolutely
demonstrate
in the home?
right.
Yes, indeed. There are a number of areas where we've had no doubt that there's been sexual abuse in the home, familial environment, and that has been an area where we've had to try and support children and young people and get them in. And indeed, one of the benefits of Aberlour's range of services is because we have the ability to look at the specialist fostering side and other areas, and indeed residential care. We're able to try and bring the connections together and see if we can provide a far more appropriate response to the young person. But they can quite clearly range. They're often, and there are situations where it is about just family breakdown in relationships, and sometimes the refuge is inappropriate for that, but there is a type of intervention that would be entirely appropriate. And this is where we have to try and get the system to connect much better to make sure that a situation where it's about supporting the parents in the home to make sense of a young teenager who's probably struggling in a range of environments, either school or at home, how to be better equipped to deal with the situation. So there are a range of responses that we need to do, and that's about getting that coordination of the system right, really.
John Wilson, you have a...
Thank you, Convener. Just as a follow-up, Mr Dunbar, your written evidence should indicate that you've only got a 3-bed unit to deal with runaways. Could you give us a figure, an estimated figure, I would understand it to be, of how many young people run away each year, and whether or not one 3-bed unit is sufficient to actually deal with the issues that young runaways are dealing with?
It's a really interesting question. If we take it on the basis that we believe 1 in 9 children run away from home each year, it's a statistic that's used regularly. If we take it that 1 in 9, we are still lucky if we achieve a 30% occupancy rate in a refuge. So you might say that there's a mismatch in terms of provision and exactly what the need is, but this is about the system connecting and whether referral processes are right and whether there's a support in the right area at the right time to enable those young people to get to that place of safety. But for us, it's been a key challenge, undoubtedly. It's caused a number of years of difficulty to understand whether indeed we can continue to run a refuge in a situation where it's not used as effectively as it could be by the various agencies that can refer. And as I say, out of 70, we last month had 17 contacts, only one of whom ended up moving to runaway. But in every situation, there were, even to the point where that connection point, the person run away at the time that they would have been coming to the service. There's an issue about trust as well. They have to understand that they are going to a place of safety, and if they've left a place that they're not very safe in, then they need to have some comfort that the system and the voluntary sector are providing that support and safety.
Thank you.
Could I come in the terms of refuge, Convener, with that?
Yes, of course.
At this point, because I think part of what Ken says, our experience, and it's a good question. Same Women provides accommodation to young homeless women. And one of the factors of runaways is it can be twofold. One, when they're old enough to run away from family abuse and into homelessness, and then face further problems within that. The other can be that to deal with the abuse within the family, they develop coping strategies such as alcohol and drug use, and then there becomes a problem within the family. So either way, and then they're thrown out. The difficulty you have in homelessness statistics across Scotland and in a particular assessment is there's no integrated assessment tool to identify that. And as long as we don't assess properly, we're never going to get the outcomes properly. And from, say, women's point of view, we have the opposite from Ken, but it's no less valid. The work that is being done by ROC is that we normally get between 35 and 50 referrals each year, and we can only house between 10 and 14. So say Women is an accommodation project, a refuge for young homeless people who are survivors of childhood sexual abuse, but also experience all the range of sexual exploitation that we've heard earlier today. And so there is an issue, and I think the issue is mainly cost. We went into a political climate where cost is a factor. Residential type accommodation and refuge is expensive to run, the nature of it. If you want to protect children and young people properly, you have to resource it properly. And we've moved to a system of community support. Now, that's not to say that's not right, but I think we need both. And the accommodation element is costly. in that sense. So local authorities face constraints, you know, within that. We're looking a bit at the new housing support legislation where you're required to provide housing support to homeless people, hoping that we'll get a better assessment of homeless young people's needs, both young women and young men, who are likely to be survivors. And the only research that links survivors of childhood sexual abuse and homelessness is way back is the CHAR report, where there was 4 in 10, and that was young girls who were in London, Glasgow and Manchester were the 3 key sites that they took evidence from, and 4 in 10 of those young girls were survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and that's where Say Women come out of. So our experience is we can't meet the demand, and Glasgow is a big city. It's got the biggest homeless population next to London and the biggest youth homelessness population next to London too. So I would see that, and also contracting out hasn't helped, I have to say, because again, it's a cost-driven exercise where we're looking at low-cost services. And when you're looking at the protection of children and young people, it really is time we start looking at putting resources in, not just for the time that they need the support, but also in the long-term prevention. Because if we don't get in young, then you've actually got a lifetime of dependence on public services, which isn't cost effective. So I think that would be my input to that, in the sense of, you might ask the question, why isn't Say Women rolled across Scotland? That lies in your hands as politicians.
Can I just come back? That's a very important contribution. Thank you. Just coming back to Mr. Dunbar, you've mentioned, and I was kind of astounded by 1 in 9 children. I assume that's up to the age of 16, is it? Yeah. Can young people, or in fact, do young people refer themselves to the refuge?
They can, and indeed there are some self-referrals. Often are people who have been connected, know the system better. Bear in mind, our refuge is one of the most secret places in the whole of Scotland, and it will remain that way. But yes, there are self-referral mechanisms, and the point that was raised about cost is an important point. I do agree that this may well be a barrier, though the impression I've got, and we've had a fairly intense set of discussions due to the viability and ongoing and the future of the refuge that we operate. We've talked to authorities, and that doesn't come back as a key issue, because at the time that intense support's needed, that cost is not great to the authority. I mean, you know, as has been mentioned, it's costly to run. It's costly to run and staff these buildings when you've got to have people available at the right time, at whichever time of the day, 24 hours. But the impression we've got back is that cost isn't a major factor. The problem is the system's not connecting quickly enough for us, and that it's helpful to hear the differences in terms of approach. But that's not to say that in the real world cost hasn't been given as considered as a real factor for non-referral. It may well be the real reality of the situation.
Okay. I wonder if I may move on to Ms. Anwar, and specifically address the question, if I may, about protecting minority ethnic victims. I mean, what do you think are the key ingredients, key factors for working sensitively to protect minority ethnic victims of CSE, including trafficking or refugee young people, and how to address any perpetrators from particular minority and ethnic backgrounds? How do you think this might be done?
It's a complex question, and I'll do my best to not take 2 hours to answer it. I think essentially there needs to be a multifaceted approach. First and foremost, there needs to be recognition amongst service providers and statutory services that minority ethnic young people are victims of exploitation. And at the moment, I think that the focus is very much on other groups. And that's not to negate from those experiences or to say that it doesn't happen within those groups, but when the focus is taken away, it takes that away from minority ethnic young people. Often they won't be looked after or accommodated. They will be in safe and secure homes, and there will be different models of exploitation used to exploiting those young people. So first and foremost, as I say, there needs to be that recognition that minority ethnic young people are vulnerable and are victims of exploitation. I would say then, moving forward, there needs to be two approaches, one around prevention, and we've heard a lot of that this morning already, and I very strongly agree with that. We have to have community outreach provision that works with both children and young people, their parents and the wider community, to raise the awareness of child sexual exploitation and make them aware of the risks that are present, and to empower them then to be able to recognise those risks and perhaps reduce that vulnerability.
To the ethnic minority situation, and how do you see that? I mean, for example, how do we look at and address perpetration without being either culturally insensitive or not taking action against abusers in the event that we might create racial tensions?
Well, I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying at the start. There needs to be a recognition that exploitation happens across communities and across ethnicities. So you'll have victims who cut across communities and ethnicities, and you'll also have individuals who will exploit across communities and ethnicities coming from various ethnic backgrounds themselves. So I know there has been a lot of focus and a lot of media attention looking at minority ethnic groups and specific models of grooming. However, we don't have the research or the data sets there in order to say that there is a specific trend or not. So I think what we need to do is take away the focus from a certain group, community or ethnicity in order to engage minority ethnic communities in a discussion, in community outreach and awareness raising sessions, both in prevention and in recovery afterwards, in order to try and build, I think, stepping stones to what we're all seeking to do here, is have an efficient national strategy and prevent exploitation within any communities.
I understand that, and I'm sorry to continue to probe, but is there a national strategy that's one size fits all, or are there deviations that we have to recognise as part of that because of, you know, as I say, the perpetration which might be done?
Yeah, I think the national strategy has to take account of cultural specific issues that both act to create minority ethnic young people, create more vulnerable situations for them to be exploited, and also in recovery afterwards, but also in tackling the fact that those who exploit young people come from all ethnicities and communities. So I think a national strategy has to explicitly state that both victims and perpetrators come across all communities. We can't focus on one because I think that's unhelpful. I think it causes community tension, and I think really it leaves a whole area and arena vulnerable. So if we start looking in just one area, we'll only find that. So we won't look for different models of sexual exploitation. We won't look from perpetrators who don't come from minority ethnic communities, and we won't look for victims who are from minority ethnic communities. So we have to ensure that the strategy looks across the board, and not just the strategy, in our approaches to how we prevent and also how we support survivors of child sexual exploitation. I think what you're trying to get at is we have to admit that, yes, we'll have minority ethnic, Asian, African, across the communities, individuals who perpetrate exploitation, as we do in the mainstream white Scottish community. And minority communities need to accept that fact as well. But we shouldn't stigmatise or stereotype one specific community as being the only type of person who will perpetrate child sexual exploitation, because it isn't helpful. On the same hand, I think we need to do a lot of confidence building, awareness raising and training within the statutory sector and the third sector of frontline staff, so they have the confidence to address issues where there perhaps might be a minority ethnic perpetrator or a minority ethnic victim, so that they're not leaving that situation alone and stepping back, which often people can do because they do have a fear of getting it wrong or of being branded racist. So we need to do a lot more of training and culturally sensitive awareness raising in that arena, which is what Roshni does. We do training with service providers, and we do community outreach and education with young people and parents.
I mean, I think there's no question of stigmatisation, but you'd really blame us if we didn't ask and probe every corner of this particularly difficult issue. Linda, do you want to?
Come in on that. I think it's useful. Anne Coffey in the All Parliamentary Group, the report for Westminster, she asked, I think, which is the crux question around who commits this, is we have to look at the perpetrators, and what we clearly know is that the vast, vast, vast majority of perpetrators are men. We cannot, with the national strategy, ignore a gendered approach. And I think, as Anne Coffey asked, and as Jim Gamble, as many of us will know from CEOP last week in the media, asked, what is turning our boys and young men into perpetrators? We have to look at where notions of power and entitlement and right and privilege are being given to our boys and to our men that creates a system where we have impacted on our boys and young men. So I think we have to take the step back and not necessarily focus so much on race, religion and culture, but I think we have to look at the culture in Scotland that feeds into the idea and that perpetuates the myth, and that we have to link across, obviously, to violence against women and make sure that the gendered notion also runs through the strategy around tackling child sexual exploitation.
Okay, John?
Just a follow-up in terms of the question and where the convener was trying to come from. In many respects, was about how do we protect young people in the Asian community to identify and report where child sexual exploitation is taking place, because we know the national debate, we know the situation in terms of the gangs that have been reported and been prosecuted in various towns and cities throughout England. But I think what, as a committee, we're trying to ensure is that every community of young people in Scotland has the same opportunity, the same way of actually coming forward to ensure that they can actually address and identify and report where there is child sexual exploitation taking place within their community, no matter who it is by, no matter the race or gender of the individual carrying out those acts. But it's to try and ensure that we actually have a way of addressing where the child sexual exploitation is taking place, no matter what community it is. And it's, are we addressing that? Are we getting that message right? Are we addressing these issues within ethnic minority communities? And particularly when we know that in some areas in ethnic minority communities, there are also the issues of trafficking as well.
I'd say that, first of all, child sexual exploitation will take place across the board of minority ethnic communities, so not just Asian, so my response will be for across the board. I think the first thing is we need to create culturally sensitive, safe spaces for minority ethnic young people to feel they can come forward and disclose. Our work and a huge range of research, including research conducted by ourselves, has shown that minority ethnic communities don't feel safe, don't feel confident and don't have trust in mainstream service providers. And for that reason, they're often not picked up and hidden or invisible to those services, so they won't come forward and report. So there needs to be an investment in minority ethnic specialist services like Roshni, who will be there to support and handle disclosures from minority ethnic communities. So that's really key, and in our written evidence we were very strong in that. There needs to be joint partnership working with the mainstream services and specialist groups in order to tie that together and create safe spaces for those young people so they can feel they can come forward and disclose. And I think until mainstream service providers accept that they've not done a very good job at reaching out to minority ethnic communities, they haven't engaged with them, they haven't built trust, and they aren't going to be able to do this by themselves, there needs to be that recognition, I think, and more implementation of culturally sensitive approaches, working in partnership with specialist agencies.
Okay. Thank you for that. Sorry, yes?
Can I add something with that? And Ken, I think, went in as well, just to... it's been our experience as well as a specialist service for young homeless women that our ability to offer a safe refuge to young people from ethnic minorities is poor. And so we're not good at it, despite developing leaflets and everything else, and we've done it. So the establishment is Roshni, because I think what the research has shown that it has to come from the community itself, and I think it's the benefit of projects like Roshni, certainly in Glasgow, who's got Scotland's biggest minority ethnic population. And I think the work they're doing is excellent, and that's the only way it can be done, because I think the mainstream services have failed. You know, certain groups, along with disabled people, were not good at that either. So you do need specialists, but you need people who are within the communities and who are sensitive to the communities, but like Roshni, who are challenging the men in those communities for abusing the young boys and girls within that community.
Okay, Ken?
Chair, yes, just to touch on some of the aspects about cultural sensitivity. Clearly within our guardianship service, one of the areas that we find with young, and a large percentage of the young people that come in contact with our guardianship service have been trafficked young people. And what we find is it takes, as well as the helping them navigate through a legal framework and helping them to establish a life in an area, there are a number of things that well, technically and legally it could be done that improves the situation here. One is certainly a better appreciation of the cultural sensitivity from all the people involved, and that does mean a good mix of the people engaged or employed by us to try and work with young people and understand their circumstances. And that goes right through to the whole technical aspect of interpreting for real. Okay, because we won't understand everything that's been said, and we need to understand, and sometimes it's interpreted differently, so we need to really get that bit absolutely right if we're going to do it. The other thing is, and it's going back to the point about that cultural awareness and the whole thing about young men growing up, but that goes back to not just the culture, but actually the education system here, because if we're going to try and get young men and young women to appreciate the difference about sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, it's about a relationships-based education system, and I'm not convinced that the education system supports that presently, and that needs to start much earlier on in the timeline if we're really going to look at prevention right. The other part for us is about tackling this whole age level. A great challenge for us is we're dealing with, and it seems inconceivable when the average age for young people leaving home is somewhere between 25 and 28, that most of our young people leave care at the age of 16 and are into an adult care environment. And until that changes and we take a different approach around this age of a young person who is never going to might be legal at an age of 16, but emotionally is a long way behind that. We need to provide a different and a far more flexible approach to how we cope with young people at that age level, and it may help improve the system and give them a better life chance.
Sorry, yes.
Sorry, could I just add something in? I just want to kind of go back to what I was saying earlier on in terms of community outreach and engagement. It's essential that we have specialist organisations there and the safe spaces for minority ethnic young people to disclose, but without that community outreach campaign that's addressing those cultural barriers, it's not just a language barrier, there's the honour and shame and other cultural issues that prevent young people from coming forward, and also families and communities that close down. They don't support the young people, they close that situation down. So we have to ensure that we're reaching those young people to take out that step of the family or wider community so they know directly where that they can go, and they will have trust and confidence within those services. So without that community outreach going alongside that specialist support, it's not going to work.
Okay, I'm very conscious that, again, as I said earlier, we could spend hours, if not days, discussing this. I'd like to move on, however, and ask Jim Eadie he's got a question for Ken and Rosina.
Thank you, Convener. My question is the same one that I asked Liz Ray of Who Cares Scotland in the previous session, and that's in relation to young people who are looked after in residential settings. We know that many of those young people rebel against the restrictions that are in place, and that they may run away to unsafe people who at first appear to treat them as equals and to allow them a degree of freedom, but who actually then go on to abuse those young people. So the question then is, how do we design residential settings or safe places to run to which are able to appeal and welcome young people?
May I respond by saying I would clearly advocate the way that Aberlour has tried to approach residential care and to augment it with the through care and aftercare bit, which we work on to give young people that confidence that they've got a home for life. Now, clearly it isn't a home for life, but we believe we maintain a connection with young people, which gives that attachment to people we've worked with a long time. And we're fortunate that we've had people that have stayed with the organisation in that setting for a long time, and there is a real connection with the young people that come through the care system there. An earlier point that was made is around this whole congruence between community awareness and understanding of what residential care is about, and how they interact, and how the education system interacts with it, and the way that we've tried to approach this by providing a very good education support system that goes behind it, and of course the whole social pedagogy approach that starts to base our approach on strengths of the young person and find the opportunities they have to grow. is key. And I'm delighted to say that some young people do leave the service going on and achieving quite fantastic results. We also recognise that young people that leave care, and I think this is the age thing again, an age of 16, are in already an emotional state, have joined us in a very difficult state, are clearly going into a world where they're vulnerable and naturally are targets for some of the most despicable characters that we have to deal with. So that unfortunately is the reality of the situation, and therefore getting this whole age bit right, support through care and aftercare, is critical to providing a better system for young people in residential care. It's also about setting the right boundaries and treating this, and I think parental rights associated with the residential care system would make a huge difference to young people, so that they are able to set these boundaries and do it with a great degree of confidence.
The question was to Rosina McRae as well.
Do you want me next, I would agree with Ken in much of what he's said. I think it takes a commitment to seeing that young person, a recognition of the sexual abuse element, because we would not separate off child sexual exploitation, because they're not mutually exclusive. Men who abuse within families are just as likely to abuse and target other young people, boys and girls outside. And so the experience of our young women is they have more than one abusive situation. And that can take a range for prostitution, etc., etc. And the more technology develops, we need to be aware we'll discover new things. God, I watch too much science fiction to see what it could be. But, you know, so I think we should stop trying to look at it. I think we have a good definition of childhood sexual abuse, which that means. And child sexploitation is the sexual abuse of young women. So when we begin that journey, when they come to us very damaged because of where they are, it's about creating a safe environment. So we create a male-only space, because as Linda has said, and I think it's quite sad, I think it's what's really lacking in the Scottish Government's paper, is that they talk, the term abusers and perpetrators are used all the time as though there's some nebulous force, and it is men who sexually abuse girls and boys. Mainly men. There are a small percentage of women, but nothing like the absolutely structural and endemic force that there is. So we have a women-only environment. We have an exclusion under the Sex Discrimination Act. Any men coming into the project, like social workers, healthcare visitors, meet in our office. So we don't take the view that it's anti-men. It's you'll say there are good men in your life who will support you through this. But for this environment, you are safe from men when you are in this project. So that's where we start off. We also maintain tenancy rights, which is unusual in homelessness, because again, that's about saying that you're going to invest in that young person for a longer term, because their experience is in, as you say, in care, multiple placements, you know, in and out. So we give 18 months tenancies with Shettleston Housing Association, and that gives them the feeling that you're beginning to invest in them. And then, as Ken says, very importantly, the staff take a semi-parental role, because you have to do that, because that's what's lacking, is a relationship with an adult that isn't abusive. And that takes care. It's almost like being that parental person, like checking in with them, how are you? Because our staff are skilled in sexual abuse, we also, they're highly trained, and I think that's an issue for residential setting. I don't think the staff get nearly enough training in how that, to recognise the extent, along with sexual exploitation, of predatory males in the community as well. So staff are very alert to any new males in their company. As we heard from Liz Ray, who cares earlier, we get cars as also drawn up. We will try and get the number plate of that, and we work very closely with the community police in Shettleston, and they will react to us because we've built up a relationship, and they will start policing that community. So you have to take very, very stringent measures to ensure the safety of those young people. Now, sometimes it's been said a lot in the panel that the young people don't recognise it's sexual exploitation. And I have views on that. I can see where it's coming from. But at the same point, we need to begin in defining the debate and who the abuser is. And the abuser is male. And they can seem to be nice men, you know, attractive men. They like them, and so they get confused. But our job as in our staff is to talk about boundaries around that, to begin discussing. Not that it's personal to them what's happened. The abuse isn't personal to them. It's not their fault. It's part of a much wider political agenda that needs to be addressed. But like Ken, very strict boundaries with the young people, because particularly from care backgrounds, they've displayed behaviour, challenging behaviour, and we've got a set of rules and regulations that are based on staff rights and tenants' rights. And we use that a lot to, about discussions. Why did you do that? Why are you behaving like that? So it's getting behind things. We also look at the relationship between the presenting behaviour, which could be alcohol and drug use, self-harm and self-injury, which is endemic, suicidal behaviour, and not seeing it as a problem. Now, self-harm is a major issue within residential settings, and the approach to it can be lacking, shall we say.
I don't want to be rude, but we have a limited amount of time, so yeah, I'm going to ask if we can kind of be brief with the questions and with the answers.
I will,
the answers are very, very interesting.
But I think it's an important issue that John raises about residential settings when we see the vulnerability of young people in care and where we're getting it wrong, and it's clearly wrong. And I also think it's about the size. Also think it's about the size of the units. They have to be small units.
The point you make about we're not getting it right at the moment, when you have a particular perspective, given that you run a women-only space, do you have any sense that you've got more success than other residential settings in being able to engage with, in your case, young women who run away from the residential setting to an unsafe place, and then are you more successful in being able to engage with them and to bring them back into a safe environment?
Probably.
My plea for brevity, because it's very important. We have several things to get through.
Probably there's a lack of research in that area, but all I know is that what shows up is even within residential care, young women are more likely to sexual exploitation and abuse within that unit. So I think women-only projects are useful alongside mainstream. I mean, I think you need both.
That's something.
Just quite an important point in relation, Chair, to the that I missed, but I was struck. I was struck by Daljit's point earlier when she mentioned about, first of all, identifying, knowing exactly what's happening in the locality and not being invited at the table when they're sharing information. The whole information sharing process, the third sector needs to be seen as trusted advisors, critically so in this area, because most of this information is understood, or the soft intelligence that's needed for the right intervention to take place is understood at the front line of the work we're doing. And I do think that there is perhaps just a lack of respect shown at times about the type of information that could be fed in to enable the statutory sector to respond in the right way. And that whole information sharing, in a similar way to the ongoing journey and transition point, we want to know our interventions are working and continuing to work in the longer term. So getting some feedback without breaching data protection, feedback of the long-term success of the work that we're doing is essential to knowing that we do the right things in the either in residential setting or indeed in the accommodation settings that we put in place afterwards. Well, you know, I believe that there are clearly case review sessions, but I mean, I'd listened to that point earlier where there's an essential collection of evidence, which is probably not a case review, but about a situation set in a community setting, where the first point of contact should have been the third sector groups that are involved in that, in a way that ensured that you collected information, triangulate what the statute sector knows alongside what the third sector and the volunteer groups know about a local area. And that needs to work in a far more effective way. And I don't think the system's in place to enable that to happen. I know there are community planning partnerships, etc., but this is working at neighbourhood level and it needs to work differently.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. This is a question for Rosina and McRae and Linda Thompson. The central importance of understanding and working actively with a gender-based analysis is stressed by both your organisations. Could you give the committee a few examples, and given the time, brief examples, in the work needed to prevent and address child sexual exploitation, where it will be particularly important to change attitudes towards young women, and particularly in the recent reports of the perceived prejudices which left young women unprotected in, for instance, some of the cases that are coming out of England?
Okay, and I will try to be brief because I know we're running over time. I think one of the core things is that we have to understand how we, in a way, view young women's sexuality. And very often young women are blamed somehow, if you look in the media, that somehow they're teen temptresses, little Lolitas. Certainly within the Jimmy Savile case, that was used for the justification. So I think we have to take a step back and look at how we view young women and what perpetuates the idea of what young women are in our culture. I think a really interesting piece of work was done in Edinburgh and is continuing to be done in Edinburgh by Scottish Women's Aid on the Hollaback campaign, and it has highlighted high levels of sexual harassment and a sexual objectification that young women experience every day. So I think the indicators are there about how young women are treated. We have to look at the cultural influences as to what creates that. I think we have to take a step back and look at the influences from the media. I think it might be interesting to look at what was presented to the Leveson inquiry as to the role of the media in presenting women in a degrading and objectified fashion. We have to look at our mainstream media, not just in kind of specialist. I think we have to look at our television shows. We have to look at the representation of age in women within those, the role of women. I think we also have to take a broader step back and look at how we engage with young men and young women around gender right from this size upwards. And let's face it, in our culture, we socialise our young men and our young women in very different ways. So I think this strategy, if we want to be courageous in Scotland and really tackle commercial sexual exploitation of children and young people, we have to take a step right back and look at all of the influences that put forward the idea as to what young women are and what young men are. And this is how we socialise our children into it. This is a courageous step that would need to be taken. However, I think if we look at how we can bring in experts from sexual health, which also in the third phase of the sexual health strategy has identified cultural change. So I think we have to take a look at the real influences. And for me, prevention is, if we look at what child protection, the UN definition, it says that child protection is about building a protective environment for our children. I would question that in Scotland we have built an entirely protective environment. And I would question, do we meet children, the rights of the child, Article 17, as public bodies, to prevent the media from putting out messages that are injurious to our children and young people? So I think there's much bigger questions can be brought in and asked on it. And I think we do have to start challenging gendered, narrow ideas, linking it in with violence against women. We do work directly with schools, but more especially with professionals. And I think there's really interesting whenever you engage young people in these debates and discussions. And I think that's where we have to start going right back to, from a long stage, age and stage appropriate developmental strategy, which engages with children and young people from nursery upwards. And we look at building upon that over a generational approach. This is not just an issue for children and young people. This is an issue broad-based.
Rosina.
Well, for brevity, I would agree with every single word of that.
That's very kind. Thank you. We're now going to have some general questions for group discussion. And I would ask Angus MacDonald to pose his question.
Thank you, Convener. I would certainly agree with your comment earlier that we could do with a few more hours to cover this issue just with the two panels that we have here today. This is a similar question to the one I asked the previous panel. As we've heard, there's been quite a bit of discussion in the evidence we've received to date about definitions of child sexual exploitation. Do you feel that these currently help or hinder efforts to protect young people? And do you think it's helpful to distinguish CSE from childhood sexual abuse in general?
I think there is debate around, is child sexual exploitation just a particular part or manifestation of child sexual abuse? I think within the definitions, what I find is quite useful in working with parents and with young people and with professionals is the definition that is provided around child sexual exploitation that takes in the notion around gifts in kind, the exchange of goods, mobile phones, whatever, house, shelter, safety, resources. So I think that is very useful for people to understand this quite specific dynamics that there can be around child sexual exploitation. And I think that, as Scotland moves forward with this, that we have to really kind of look at, actually more importantly for me, is how we frame notions of choice within this, within our definitions, how we frame and bring in elements around that. And again, I think, as Ken has spoken earlier and other members of the previous panel is how we break the notion of child, teen, adult. And I think that's really important, of how we make the links with child sexual exploitation into sexual exploitation of adults as well. So I think it's about how we create a bigger continuum and that greater link across with our definitions and understanding.
Okay. Ms. Anwar?
Sorry, you can go first.
No, go on, you go.
For me, I think I just want to reiterate what was said by one of the members earlier on, is that it's great to have a definition, but if people aren't aware of it, what's the point of it? And that's really what we have to have awareness around amongst frontline staff and amongst the community as well, that it definitely is a part of childhood sexual abuse, but we need to be clear that sexual exploitation, as you're saying, has its own dynamics and its own circumstances, and I think staff really need to be made aware of that, to have that sea change of opinion away from young people or young girls making their own choices. It is about power, it is about control, and I think we need to raise that awareness across the board.
Yes, I don't think it's helpful at all. I think childhood sexual abuse has evolved. Well, I'm old enough, unfortunately, to remember when it was much more one-dimensional. But as technology goes, it was bad enough, I thought, when mobile phones, when women were being raped and sexually abused, and then it went around the mobile phone network. Now we have got it whole scale on the net, and children get access to it. So I think childhood sexual abuse, the definition, identifies the sexual abuse of children, which is any sexual contact, which is what childhood sexploitation is about. It's not as though it isn't for a purpose. The purpose is for some man to abuse young girls and boys. And I think... No distinction at all, because for the young women, I think Linda's point's right, for young women, given the way they're brought up, and young boys, the way they're socialised as well, there is a confusion in that, shall we say, minor end yet, but it's not minor in the scheme how girls see themselves in society and how boys see themselves and girls in society. And what we're dealing with is masculinity. And we're doing, certainly girls and women no favour, but we're certainly not doing boys and men any favour either.
Yeah.
I would agree with everything that's been said. It should be treated as part of a continuum, really. The child sexual exploitation, sexual abuse. I do come back to the earlier point about making sure that we get the whole education prevention message right about what healthy relationships are about, because if it doesn't start at that earlier age, we are going to continue to struggle to help young people, teenagers in particular, make sense of their lives and the relationships that they can get into. Some of which will be potentially abusive. So I don't see a clear distinction, though it's fair to say in the examples of some young people that have come through our services where they've suffered from sexual exploitation, the scale and the horrific nature of the process and the type of support that's needed in those very critical moments are significant. And it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be any different at any stage in a young person, a child's journey if they've suffered sexual abuse. But we do need to look at the scale of it when it comes to young people, particularly trafficked young people who have faced sexual exploitation either en route or indeed at their destination, and that's something that we have to think about very carefully and get the system in place. And start to get over the age issues, where we're there about caring young person who's vulnerable, who's come through a difficult situation.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move, because I am conscious of the time, move to the last question, which is from Anne McTaggart.
Thanks, Convener. And it is about moving forward and giving some best examples about how the statutory and the criminal justice service work with the voluntary sector. Give us some concrete examples of how best you think that could happen.
Chair, I start with coming back to that point earlier about information and sharing and getting a better analysis. We've talked earlier about the downside of the internet and social media and everything. The positive side is this gives us data in a way that we need to interpret this differently and use it to be able to take the right route and interventions. And that means that the statutory bodies, third sector, and indeed everybody that has an ability to understand what's going on in the area can share that information. So there's a bit around that information sharing, neighbourhood-based sharing of information that will help the right interventions to be made at the right time for every young person that could be affected. That would be one of the key messages I want to get across, because I feel that we're just failing to grasp the level of information we've got that we can use to make interventions at the right time. Yes, I think, and for us, the examples are patchy, and I think that's the most
depressing thing on it. It depends on individuals within it, and we're dealing with big forces. But in terms of the statutory, I think health faces a particular problem. We find health professionals as obstructive and very negative and dismissive of the voluntary sector. Very difficult for us to get ourselves into care reviews about young people that we're involved with, because the CE is not professional. They'll ask you what qualifications your staff have, etc. So we're a bit of a force, and we try to get ourselves in, but we're not as successful as other areas. So social work, I think, and the police are much more involved in partnership working than health is, which is a big issue. I think in the sense of the police, what we were worried about the Scottish Police Force, as we said in our submission, is there's some very good work that's going on with Strathclyde Police, and I don't know if that's Scotland-wide, but Strathclyde Police had a third-party reporting mechanism for all the frontline women's organisations in Glasgow and throughout. So if a case didn't have enough evidence to go through trial, we could still report that man to them, and they would log it into a computer, and what they did was build up an evidence base on a number of things. Similarly with childhood sexual exploitation, as it's defined differently, they would also log that. So they're building up a picture of an abuser. Now, we don't know if that's going to be transferred to the Scotland-wide police force, but we think it's something that's definitely worth looking at. And as Ken says, the community police. In terms of the criminal justice system, it's very difficult, as you know. I am a big believer about sentencing. I think the sentences that are given out to male abusers are ridiculous, quite frankly. They're an insult to the children and young people in our society. And I do have sympathy with Linda's that we're not good at protecting children in our society. We like to think we are, and we boast about it, but we're not. And the criminal justice system, you saw last week the case in Clydebank, the wee 4-year-old in Asda was sexually abused by a man in a toilet, and he got 2.5 years. I mean, that is ludicrous, absolutely shocking. No, it's not. It's the criminal justice system, as I remember Anne is asking me. So I think the terms of minimum sentencing is something we should be looking at in the terms of sending out a clear message to abusers. I also think the criminal justice system should follow some of the American system, in that you allow expert witnesses, which is the voluntary sector, or people who are involved in the care of that young person, to give evidence on the effects that that abuse has on them. And I think that would also help sentences for the juries to understand, because it's very difficult for juries who don't know anything about it, given we lack public awareness campaigns about the whole range, and I think that would help.
I'd like just to finish with Linda and Ella, please.
I mean, I'm coming from a slightly different angle, because a lot of my work is about prevention, education and awareness raising. But I would like to share an example where I think multi-agency has worked particularly well. You know, in central Scotland, and has also been repeated in Perth and Kinross, we have linked in with police, education, criminal justice, social work, the voluntary sector, and ran quite large-scale awareness raising and public education events. So it was all the partners coming together, and over the course of 4 days, we had 2,100 parents and carers came along to hear information around internet safety, sexualisation, gender, sexual roles, violence against women and sexual exploitation. And I think that's an example, not so much on dealing with criminal justice in that way and the police in that way, but that's an example where multi-agency can come together really effectively to engage with local communities and parents.
I think, to give another concrete example, we deliver a project, our SAFE project, which works with young people from 6 to 16, and in that we go out and deliver messages for other organisations. So we've engaged with a range of police, health and other agencies who can't access those communities for the issues I was describing before, and we've taken their message and made it culturally sensitive, and we're putting it out to ensure that those communities are not being missed out. So I think that would be a concrete example. But one other thing I would like to mention, aside from the partnership working, I was saying that's essential, information sharing, which of course goes across the board, is ethnic monitoring and recording, both of victims and of perpetrators, which is something that's not happening adequately at the moment, which is what's leading to a lack of knowledge in this area. And I think it's very easy to draw conclusions about Asian groomers or about victims, as the media has done, but without the data to back anything up or to refute any claims, it's very, very difficult. So I think ethnic monitoring is a must. It must happen.
No, I'm going to stop. We're way over time. It's been very interesting, and thank you very much for not just your verbal commentary, but also the written submissions, which will be a foundation, I think, of us going forward with this analysis. As I said earlier, I wish we'd had probably 2 days, never mind 20 minutes or 40 minutes. So thank you very much. I'm going to suspend for a minute while we allow the witnesses to leave and the new panel to appear.
If I could resume our committee, we're now on agenda item 3, consideration of new petitions. The next item of business is consideration of new petitions. There are 2 new petitions for consideration today. As previously agreed, the committee has invited the petitioners to speak to both of them. The first new petition is PE 1477 by Jimmy Ray on behalf of the Throat Cancer Foundation on gender-neutral HPV vaccination. Members of a note by the clerk, the spice briefing and the petition. Could I welcome our witnesses today, Jimmy Ray, who's the Chief Executive, and Ewan Lumsden, Information Support Manager of Throat Cancer Foundation, to the meeting. I can invite Jimmy Ray to make a short statement of around 5 minutes to set the context for the issues he's looking at for the petition, and then I'll throw open by asking some questions. Mr. Ray.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for the opportunity to come along today. I'd like to start by saying why I'm so interested in this. I was diagnosed with oropharyngeal cancer in July 2010, and it was caused by a virus called the human papillomavirus. Thankfully, I've gone on to make a good recovery, but my experience of the whole treatment regime and the effects of the virus were pretty awful, to be honest, and it leaves several quality of life issues for anyone who suffers from human papillomavirus infection that goes on to cancer. And just to cover some of the background to the HPV scenario, we're now dealing with a global epidemic of this virus. It is responsible for 5% of all cancers worldwide and growing. And you're probably aware that by 2020, the latest statistics show that 1 in every 2 people will be affected by cancer, so half the people in this room. So it's an issue that we need to be very aware of, not just because of the burden on individuals, but the burden on society and the economy and everything else in paying for this. HPV is a virus that's caused by skin contact. It never enters the bloodstream. It lives in the skin. It's very easy to catch. In fact, by the middle age, 80% or more of the population will have been infected by it. So most of the people in this room will have been exposed to the human papillomavirus. It's not to panic, everyone, because thankfully most people will go on to clear the virus, but a growing number of people aren't, and they're at risk, considerable risk, from strains of this virus. There's no cure, but there is a vaccine, and that's why I'm here. At the moment, the vaccine is given only to girls to protect against cervical cancer, which is one of 5 strains of cancer caused by this virus. The other strains are anal cancer, penile cancer, vulval cancer, and oropharyngeal cancer. all very nasty, treatable, but the side effects of treatment and ongoing quality of life issues, if you survive, are awful. And my contention is, why are we only protecting a certain sector of society? The argument in the policy just now is that if you vaccinate enough girls, then boys will be protected. I would argue if we were in the 1950s, that may be almost acceptable, but we're not. We're in the 21st century. We're a highly mobile population. The UK has good vaccination rates. The rest of the world doesn't in general. So if you're travelling, you're going to be exposed if you have sexual contact with someone overseas, or even someone living here who's not been vaccinated. And if you are from sector of society, men who have sex with men, then you have no protection. So it's a very serious issue. There's an equality issue, not just for men who have sex with men, but for all men. Men are equal to women. There's no reason why they shouldn't be protected from this, and that's my contention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ray. And I noticed in your petition you said that you felt that the current HP vaccination programme is discriminatory. I think you've touched on that at the end of your comments. Would you perhaps like to say a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, I suppose I don't want to make this an issue of sexuality, or men have sex with men, but that's probably the most obvious area, because herd immunity, as it's classed, where you immunise and vaccinate girls, will give some protection to men. Not all men, but some protection to men. But if you are from sector of society, men have sex with men, you have no protection, and that's discriminatory. And this was one of the key areas that the Australian government looked at. They have introduced gender-neutral vaccination as of this year, and they are world leaders and pioneers in this, and they've taken the right decision. A lot of this is based on a lot of the decisions not to vaccinate everyone is based on cost, and that's laudable. I can understand that. But the modelling on cost effectiveness is dated. It didn't include the latest types of cancers, and this is an area that needs to be addressed. And it's interesting because the guy, there's an aside, convener, the guy who discovered the vaccine is actually a Glaswegian, so it's another Scottish first, which is great. He lives in Australia, but he is very much Scottish. And I think Scotland has a fantastic reputation for innovation in science, and I think we should be taking another lead in doing the right thing here.
I know, and final questions, I know costs are quite difficult to ascertain because of commercial confidentiality, but if I picked the figure up right, you think it may be around 1.2 million in Scotland. Is that correct?
It is very difficult. We've been given figures from the Nordic countries where we've got a baseline of €18 per dose for the vaccine there. I would argue that Scotland, if it were to take a unilateral decision to implement this, which it can, is in a very strong position to negotiate a very good deal with pharma. And the reason for that is that it's very much in the pharmaceutical industry's interests to have countries adopt gender-neutral vaccination.
Right. Thank you very much for that. Now I'll throw it open to my colleagues. Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I should declare at the start that Jamie Ray is known to me as a friend and former colleague, and I met with Jamie in February to discuss the issue. So, good morning, Jamie. Morning, Ewan. The research that we've received has flagged up that there are 120 identified subtypes of HPV. So, for clarification, would the immunisation programme cover all 120 subtypes, or would it just be the high-risk ones, such as HPV 16 and HPV 18?
Yeah. The best coverage available is for 16, 18, 6 and 11. And it's a good question. This is a really complicated and growing area of interest for lots of scientists. And Scotland, again, is doing a lot of good work here. But there's still so much we don't know about the human papillomavirus. You know, if we went back 10, 15 years ago, there was very little or no link to throat cancer, for example. We now know it's responsible for virtually all cases of oropharyngeal cancer now, particularly in younger men who don't smoke or drink, which were the typical risk factors in the past. So no, there's not a one-size-fits-all, but there is a good quadrivalent vaccine which does provide protection for the most dangerous strains of this virus. And that's the one that's now being used in Scotland.
Thanks. You actually touched on the costs in Norway, which I was going to come on to. I note from the petition that you've costed the 3-dose vaccination at £45 from figures that you've obtained from Norwegian health authorities. Now it's always good to err on caution. However, given that most goods in Norway, and in my experience, are nearly twice the cost that they are here, it may be that your cost for the extension of the programme for 27,000 12-year-olds in Scotland may well be lower than the figure that you suggest. And if a deal can be done with the manufacturers, it could become even lower again. I find the Scandinavian or Nordic countries are pretty much ahead of us on health issues. Do you know if any of the Scandinavian countries have plans to introduce HPV immunisation programmes for boys?
Denmark are seriously looking at this just now, and we believe they're very close to making this decision. And that's the only thing I can comment just now, because I don't know about the others.
Australia. So
yeah, Australia. The United States have recommended vaccination for all boys, and as has Canada. And it's been adopted in 2 provinces now in Canada where boys are routinely vaccinated.
You've submission, the last paragraph, you actually refer to Australia introducing the vaccination for young men. In the paragraph before that, you've actually suggested it should be 12-year-old boys in Scotland. Can you tell me what is the difference? When you talk about young men, what is the age range that Australia's introduced this? And I'm assuming that the 12-year-old boys, it would be year-on-year vaccinations for 12-year-olds, so it would be a recurring cost, hopefully a decreasing recurring cost as the vaccine gets used more readily.
With the reason we've said for 12-year-old boys to be vaccinated is the vaccine itself works best prior to any sexual activity. That's why the vaccine just now is given to young ladies about 12 years old as well. So it's just a practical measure to make sure that people are getting the most, it's the most effective use of the vaccine. If we can get the boys vaccinated at a younger age as well, it's just to be more effective. So young men, young people aged 12 and under.
Maybe just add to that. There is evidence that the vaccine does have a prophylactic effect. So even if you've been exposed to some strains of the virus, it doesn't mean to say it's too late to be vaccinated. But best practice is definitely to vaccinate before any sexual activity, because it's so contagious, it's so easy to catch, that you're better to act as early as possible.
Thank you.
Okay, Jim Moody.
Thank you, Clearly this would be a decision for Scottish ministers to take, informed by scientific evidence and advice from officials. Now, the Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation aren't currently minded to recommend HB vaccine to be made available on a gender-neutral basis. And I was struck by the point that you made reference to, which is that they feel that there would be sufficient protection for heterosexual males because of the exposure to girls who had been vaccinated. And that point about discrimination isn't lost, I'm sure, on the committee. But I'm just wondering what independent source of advice and evidence, therefore, are you aware of that would help influence any decision by the Scottish Government, given that the Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation is not currently in favour?
It's a good question, Mr. Reedy. And if you actually look at the people who've signed the petition before you, over 150 of them are medical experts. And some of these experts are world leaders in their field. For example, our own Professor Heather Cubey, who was just until recently led the HPV research lab in Edinburgh, is in favour of gender-neutral vaccination, and she's considered a world-leading expert in this field. So it's interesting when we have people like Professor Cubey who are disagreeing with the JCVI. We also have Professor Margaret Stanley, Head of Virology at Cambridge University, and again credited as one of the world-leading experts on HPV. And she's very much in favour of what we are suggesting. I could go on. The 150 are considerably experienced health professionals. Some of them are international, and many of them are lauded and have won accolades the world over for their research work and what they've done. So the body of experience out with the JCVI is considerable, and I would hope that the Scottish ministers, if they're minded to do so, would look beyond, you know, the narrow advice that's coming from that statutory body.
Are you aware of any associated side effects or risks associated with this particular vaccination?
No, there's been some press speculation, and there are individual cases with all vaccination programmes, but we've been using it now in Scotland, I think, since 2007. It's a very safe drug, and the profile of the vaccine shows no significant problems. You know, the most common issue is some redness and soreness around the area where the vaccine's administered in the arm, and that's pretty much as far as it goes.
There is a lot of adverse press, particularly in America, about the Gardasil, particularly the Gardasil vaccine, but a lot of it's very unsubstantiated. It's based on very loose interpretations of adverse reactions, because adverse reactions when it comes to vaccination, it's every single thing that happens. It's not necessarily related to a vaccine. So, for example, if someone has been given the Gardasil vaccine and then they die in a road traffic accident, it's still listed as an adverse reaction. So there's some very, very loose reporting, particularly in America, about the Gardasil vaccine in particular. But every expert we've spoken to, and all the evidence that we've seen for research into the efficacy of the vaccine shows that it's a very, very safe vaccine with, the minimal side effects of redness. Some people faint, but that's more to do with needles rather than the actual vaccine itself.
Anna Taggart.
The question's just been asked
right.
Side effects,
Right.
thank you.
Thank you for that. Do other members wish any other questions or point to put to our witnesses? No. I mean, it's clearly a very interesting, well-researched petition, so thank you both for that. From my own view, I think we certainly need to continue this to seek further advice from key organisations. Obviously, the Scottish Government, Health Protection Scotland, Cancer Research UK, I think would all make sense. But again, can I throw it open to members to see if members are agreeable with that course of action, or whether they would like other organisations to be added to that list? Angus MacDonald.
The petition should be continued. Have we mentioned Stonewall and the Gay Men's Health Group? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think they should also be contacted for their views.
Taggart? Yeah, happy with that course of action?
Yeah, who have we agreed to ask?
Yeah, so far, Scottish Government, Health Protection Scotland, Cancer Research UK. And sorry, I missed your point, Angus MacDonald. Could you just repeat that?
Solely just to contact Stonewall and the Gay Men's Health Group.
Right, thank you.
Can I make a further suggestion?
Yes. Jabidi?
The Scottish Cancer Coalition, which is an umbrella organisation representing the range of cancer charities in Scotland.
Right. And perhaps we, Jimmy Ray mentioned some of the medics who'd signed a petition. It might be useful if we approach some of them as well, because they've obviously got a lot of expertise in this subject. Is that agreeable, or do members have any other course of action we should pursue? Well, as you've heard, we're obviously very interested in your petition. We'll continue this, and we'll obviously keep you up to date with developments. I think you've raised a very interesting point, and we'll make sure we get as much evidence as we can, and we'll keep you in touch with developments. So thank you again for coming along, and I'll suspend for 2 minutes to allow our witnesses to leave and our new witnesses to join us. Thank you. If I could continue with our committee, the second new petition today is PE 1481 by Pat Rafferty, Harry Donaldson and Harry Frew, behalf of Unite, GMB and UCAT on the end to blacklisted in Scotland. Members of a note by the clerk, the spice briefing and the petition. Can I welcome our three witnesses who are well-kent faces? So thank you very much for coming along today. And could invite Pat Rafferty to do a short statement of around 5 minutes. I'll kick off with a couple of questions and I'm sure my colleagues will have a number of questions as well. And I think Neil Finlay, who's taken a great interest in this, also wishes to contribute. So can I start with Pat Rafferty?
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon. Well, no, sorry, it's still good morning. I was about to say good afternoon there. We warmly welcome this opportunity to submit evidence to the Scottish Parliamentary Petitions Committee on blacklisting. The Scottish Parliamentary debate of Thursday the 2nd of May on blacklisting was titled "A Scottish and UK Human Rights Abuse." In no way was the debate's title over-dramatic or exaggerated. This insidious discrimination of our employment system, particularly in the construction sector, is a scandal that has affected and continues to affect workers and families across Scotland and the UK. It's a national disgrace that has ruined lives and indelibly stained our construction industry, its biggest employers and successive governments. Most of you now will be very familiar with the published findings in the Westminster Scottish Affairs Committee, SAC, and its interim report on blacklisting across the UK and the revelations of the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, investigation into the consultant agency, the TCA. The work of the ICO and SAC certainly laid bare the depths which major construction industry companies sank to in order to actively exclude and discriminate against workers, predominantly for their trade union and political activities. What we do know with certainty is that the TCA files held details of 3,213 construction workers, many of them trade unionists, and traded them for profit and subversive purposes. What we heavily suspect is that we are only beginning to scratch the surface of this scandal. As we move ahead with proceedings today, and the work of the ICO and SAC is frequently cited, it is vitally important to make clear to everyone in this room that blacklisting is not just a problem of the past. Blacklisting didn't disappear with the ICO investigation in 2009, and far from it. We are now in no doubt that its practice continues today on major infrastructure projects across the UK, and the influence of its known practitioners runs deep into the Scottish economy. Our evidence submission today will focus extensively on our strong view that blacklisting is currently taking place on major infrastructure developments such as London's Crossrail and the biggest construction project in Europe. The sacking of 28 workers on the Crossrail project in September 2012 through the termination of contractor Electrical Installation Services, EIS, by BAM Ferrovial Care, the BFK consortium, for raising basic health and safety concerns relating to tunnelling work suggests to us that the blacklisting of trade unionists is a practice that continues. However, blacklisting is not a problem confined to the South East, nor is it incumbent solely on Westminster to tackle, and nor should we have to wait on Westminster to begin to resolve the problem. The insufficient legislation framework at UK level and the evident lack of political appetite to recognise blacklisting as a contemporary issue and reform the law to combat its practice needs to be bypassed by other levels of governance. In Scotland, we have the ways and the means to start tackling blacklisting in a serious manner, and we need to do that. The companies involved in the BFK consortium and also through their subsidiary companies profit significantly from the Scottish public procurement agenda. They do so alongside many of their contemporaries also named in the ICO investigation and the SAC report. These companies hold public contracts worth billions of pounds with responsibilities for the delivery of essential services in our public sector and for both local and national infrastructure development. So we are firm in our view that a distinct Scottish political intervention is required as the influence of the known blacklisting firms runs deep into the heart of the Scottish economy. No one can credibly argue that blacklisting has never taken place in Scotland or can prove that it doesn't continue to this day. Over the last few months, there has been a sustained programme of parliamentary activity that's helping to raise the profile of the anti-blacklisting campaign. thanks in no small part to the hard work of MSPs like Neil Findlay, who is here today. Today provides us with another opportunity to reinforce our campaign in view of what we believe the Scottish Parliament can do in order to tackle blacklisting. This involves introducing anti-blacklisting measures in the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill, including prohibiting known blacklisting companies from tendering for future public contracts, and the launch of an independent public inquiry convened by the Scottish Government into the extent of blacklisting across Scotland, the companies involved and the human damage done. We believe that existing UK blacklisting laws are insufficient and cannot be relied upon to represent the interests of the worker, let alone deliver justice. The Scottish Parliament, via its current scope of powers, can help begin the process of bringing this gap in the justice system through procurement reform measures. The calls of the joint trade unions for a UK-wide Leveson-style inquiry into the blacklisting scandal have, so far, been resisted by the Westminster Coalition Government. We believe it is unacceptable that to date, not one company named in the ICO has apologised for its discriminatory actions and not one worker has been compensated for being blacklisted. It cannot be business as usual for the blacklisting companies. We are looking for the Scottish political community to help us achieve change, justice and to protect the next generation of workers in Scotland and beyond from the insidious practice of blacklisting. This also extends to the local authorities, who can play a proactive role in questioning the likes of BFK Consortium's influence in their own local authorities and also supporting our wider campaign for justice and reform. And finally, we hope the evidence we present here today both informs and provokes our representatives on the Petitions Committee to grasp this historical and contemporary effect of blacklisting and to also put in place a renewed Scottish parliamentary impetus to demonstrate that Scotland can lead the way in the fight against blacklisting. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much for your statement. And again, I think I should congratulate the trade union movement for the work that you've all carried out on this very high-profile issue. I mean, it seemed, Mr. Rafferty, when you were giving your talk, there was a touch of going back to the 1950s in America with McCarthyism, because that's very much what happened around that era. And I think some of your suggestions around procurement and through an inquiry are also very useful as well. Before I bring Neil Findlay in, I had just one point I wanted to touch on. I think in the papers you made reference to, I think at least one individual was prosecuted under breaches of data protection. And as you know, we have a strong data protection regime in Scotland. Do you think that needs to be strengthened? Do you think there's still some breaches of data protection which has led to this blacklisting currently?
I do believe there is gaps in the data protection, and I don't know that there was certainly, I don't know if you got a chance to catch the programme last night in BBC One's Panorama that covered the blacklisting in the UK, and the ICO itself was raising concerns about its lack of power, its lack of bite in terms of trying to address a lot of these issues. So yes, it certainly should be strengthened, and as I say, that's even coming from the ICO itself indicating that.
Thank you for that. I'll bring in, first of all, Neil Findlay to make a brief comment.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think anybody who did see the Panorama programme last night, I think in a very short space of time, a half-hour programme, it condensed the whole issue very well, and also raised the concern that, as Pat Rafferty has said, that blacklisting continues. But first of all, I think we should commend the petitioners for bringing this petition forward. More importantly, commend the members of various trade unions who for decades have suspected that this practice has been going on, many of whom have suffered very badly themselves and their families have suffered as a result. I think it's the determination of these people who we really have to thank, and hopefully they will see justice. The issue in Panorama that raised was that the issue in relation to Crossrail and how these practices are continuing. My fear is that they are continuing in Scotland as well, and only an inquiry would unearth that. If we look at some of the major contracts that are being let in Scotland at the moment, for example, the Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital, one of the contractors groups who are down to the last three for that contract is stuffed full of contractors who have been up to their necks in blacklisting. If we look at the Aberdeen bypass similarly, that's the situation. And also the Forth Bridge, the consortium who are involved in the construction of the Forth Bridge, are full of companies who were involved in blacklisting. Now, the question is, have these companies changed their practices? Let's hope they have. But I think until the companies admit what they did wrong, apologise to those who they wronged, and agree to pay compensation, and finally agree to get their house in order, then we cannot be confident that these practices are in the past. So, and another thing I would paraphrase suggested that this is only scratching the surface of this issue. I think if you start to think about some of the other industries where this practice has alleged to have been practiced over the years, I'm thinking about things like journalism, in academia, in the offshore industry. It's also been suggested in things like contract catering and other industries. I think we are only scratching the surface. So I certainly would support the petitioner's call for an inquiry. If Westminster aren't going to do it, then let this Parliament lead, take the lead in Scotland and let us do it. But I also believe that we need major reform of the procurement process to ensure that such practices... I'm not naive enough to think that these practices will be gone forever. I think there's very little you can do to wipe it out entirely. But we should be putting in place systems that get the message over to companies who look to benefit from major public sector contracts, that if they indulge in this, then they will be dealt with properly.
Thank you very much for that. Can I bring in Chick Brodie?
Thank you. Morning, gentlemen. And Neil. Let me start from, I have with some experience dealing with trade unions and with employee participation companies, and perhaps some companies where management was a bit draconian and had to be changed. But let me start from the issue of those that are blacklisted. My experience of dealing with the AUEW, with Willie McKelvey and Ernie Ross and all these guys years and years ago in Dundee, was that there would be openness and transparency. And certainly, I know that the managers I dealt with worked pretty hard at that. However, there were those within the trade union, not many, whose activities ultimately were designed to hurt the 6,500 employees that were employed. Do you believe that all of these people who have been blacklisted are bona fide good employees, or do you believe that there just might be a different agenda?
I believe they're bona fide people who have been discriminated against because of the blacklisting process. I don't believe these people have been out there to try and purposely undermine an employer in any way, shape or form. That's not in anybody's interest, certainly not in the trade union's interest, and the people who work on these contracts. It's in all our interest that employers and good industrial relationships takes place, and that secures employment going forward. It would never be the agenda to try and undermine that in any way, so I don't accept that.
Because there are some, in the notes that we've received, there are serious implications in the comments that have been made for full disclosure of information obtained by CA that ask for links between not just the employers, but the police and the security services. Why do you have an issue with the police and the security services? What do you think they are doing in terms of corroborating this blacklist?
Well, sorry, Harry. No. There is questions that goes beyond, for the police. The police force itself, can go back to issues that we go for the miners, for example, in the miners dispute and involvement in this. Yeah.
In Scotland.
In Scotland. Well, what we want to try and get from the police service itself is what information that the police service holds, or department holds, in terms of people being blacklisted, that's been a contributing factor from the police services.
Information calls about links between the employers and the police and the security services. not just asking for open information. The information that we've got is that you're asking for an investigation into the links between construction employers, the police and the security services. Why are you asking for that investigation?
Matter of trying to provide them, get the information from the police service itself to see whether there is established links between that, the employers and the police service.
Just one last question. I abhor blacklisting. I think just as much as I abhor bad management, and there's a lot of that around. But, you know, you're asking the Scottish Government to do something while there's a select Scottish Affairs Committee is currently going through an inquiry, and I think the Minister set out in terms of the current legislative framework that although it said blacklisting was not illegal, and we can argue that maybe it should be, that we will have a better position in terms of, in Scotland, within the terms within the public contracts regulations of 2012, and we, of course, we have the Public Procurement Bill, which I'm sure all of us will want to ensure secures openness and transparency as to how contracts are disposed of and the conditions therein. So, I mean, what do you expect from a Scottish Government public inquiry that's not being done or not covered or not will be covered going forward?
Sorry, on you.
I think the reality there would be the situation where disproportionately, if you look at the figures, you know, Pat's already alluded to the fact that 3,213 people were on the blacklist. That's what the Information Commissioners found. Only 10% of these people actually know that they've been blacklisted. The rest still don't know. Out of that, there is 582 workers in Scotland. So disproportionately, Scotland fare high out of these figures, comparatively speaking, with the rest of the UK. That's why we firmly are of the belief that the Scottish Parliament should take a lead in this. There should be a public inquiry. And again, it's back to what Neil Findlay has addressed there in terms of the indications, that there should be apologies, because there is no indication as yet by these employers of any consideration of the hurt, the injury to families and everybody else that's been involved. Bearing in mind, most of these people, when they were blacklisted, were between the ages of 30 to 50. Now, they have been out of the industry, unable to pursue their employment, unable to gain gainful employment and provide for their families. Now, that is significant. We firmly are of the belief that there is room, there is certainly scope. We see the same companies in public procurement, and looking for all these. Scottish Water would be another one where there's billions of pounds up, the same companies involved. To flip the question you asked earlier, which was about, you know, do you believe some trade unionists may well have had ulterior motives? I would flip the question and say that 60% of those HR managers who were employed during that period of time are still employment in these companies, and maybe flip the question back towards the companies. And it may well be the issue is that that's why a public inquiry should actually take place.
I accept, I mean, first of all, I don't agree with blacklisting, and I accept that we have, in some cases, bad management. But I think in that spirit, you can't tell me that all of these people are okay, and that, you know, and immediately when you, as I say, you brought in the police and the security services, you then begin to think, well, you know, what else is going on? Why? And that's why I question, against the background of what I said about management and blacklisting.
The interesting thing about the police and the security services, I think that's really came about through, there is something between 200 and 300 females, green activists, who are actually on the lists, who have been targeted also, to our understanding. And there is a view, where does that type of information come from? Because they don't all work in the construction industry, that's for sure.
I believe any action is unlikely from these people which would hurt and harm, you know, the vast majority of workers that they might be working with.
There is a belief, there is no proof.
Right.
I must make that point. That hence the reason for a request for a public inquiry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, good morning, gentlemen. Oh, sorry, good afternoon. Can I explore with you the second half of the petition, which is about, and I quote, investigate how to introduce ethical procurement policies and how to ensure that companies who continue to practice blacklisting are banned from tendering for future public contracts. Because that then opens up the whole issue of how we ensure the reform of the procurement process, perhaps through the Procurement Reform Bill, perhaps through the consultation that I understand the Scottish Government is undertaking with the trade unions, the STUC, Unite, Unison and the GMB, to strengthen the guidance for public bodies, which would allow us an opportunity to address that. But could I just get a feeling, a sense from you as to what kind of issues should be covered as part of that reform of the procurement process? Are we talking about what kind of additional questions of suppliers during the selection stage of a procurement exercise should we be looking at? For example, how do we ensure that we have revised terms and conditions of contracts that would allow us to address this issue, and perhaps the issue of termination clauses for those companies who breach either legislation or guidance?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, as an opportunity with the new procurement bill going through, and this is a good opportunity to change and make things a wee bit stricter and tighter. Certainly, you know, the message or the information that we got as a suggestion, one of the questions could be, have you, been prosecuted in the past for blacklisting? Now, I don't think that in any way addresses the issue, because anything that happened prior to 2009, then nobody has been prosecuted through that whole period. Even through the consulting agency itself. Ian Kerr was prosecuted under the Data Protection Act and was fined by the courts at the time. And that fine was paid by one of the contractors. Not to Ian Kerr, but to his wife and his daughter. I don't know why, but that's the method of payment and how it came about. So the questions in terms of procurement have got to be a bit tighter and stricter than that. I mean, we're dealing with a group of companies here who have already been to court and been prosecuted under the construction cartels that was set up on the price rigging of contracts. And, quite a number of these companies were involved in that. So that's, one issue. And an issue to address certainly through procurement and make it a bit tighter. But
suggestions on what types of questions we should...
We have met with Paul McNulty and, made it clear to him that, these types of questions have got to be framed in such a way that, it makes it very, very difficult for companies who have been using these practices in the past to continue using them. We are meeting, as trade unions, and no doubt we'll be going back to Paul McNulty with, some suggestions on, what we think would make things a bit more stringent and a bit tighter. It's got to be given careful consideration in how, the questions are framed.
Is there an opportunity there to do something better?
I think there is an opportunity to address some of the issues. But, whether companies continue. Remember, historically, going back to the Economic League, way back in the 50s and 60s, where, after, people were saying, well, that's the Economic League finished, it doesn't happen now. But this consulting association was set up, and it was still going on. And I have no doubt that, in the comments that Pat Rafferty has made, that, projects such as Crossrail, there is, a hint that it's still going on. So, how do we address that in terms of Scottish procurement, and how do we address it, these contractors who have been involved in it? Certainly, we as a trade union, UCAT, are going to, or we've went to the European courts and lodged a claim in there for one member. And that's on the basis of discrimination in terms of employment. Maybe, that's the type of questions, have you ever discriminated against workers, whatever. The answer would probably come back as no. How do you then prove that? Certainly, when you look at the Scottish Affairs Committee and the comments that was on individual files about, certain people, as a disgrace that people are denied the right to work because of these comments. And it's, you know, right up until the Consultant Association was raided to access the files. Right up to that point, it was still getting used. And if that hadn't happened, it would still be getting used today, and we wouldn't know anything about it. And we wouldn't be able to prove anything about it. We've now got the evidence. We've now had some of these companies come in front of the Scottish Affairs Committee who have admitted, yes, we used it. So if the admission is an admission of guilt, then, you know, there's an opportunity there for to deal with some of these issues. And procurement may be an answer for it.
Does Mr Rafferty or Mr Donaldson have anything to add to that?
In terms of the question, the tender documents, you may well want to potentially look at, have you treated anyone less favourably because of their trade union activities or membership? And I think the issue becomes then that any false information provided on a document, tender document such as that, if proven to be elsewhere, these major companies would be excluded. You know, there is proof at the moment, there is evidence, there is documentation which is going. There is actually 70 cases being lodged at the High Court in London by the GMB as of last week in pursuance to these matters under defamation. So again, we do know we have the proof, we have the evidence, we have the documents available. So a simple question like that, yes, obviously a company could tell lies, but I would have to suggest they would need to think seriously before they've done so, because if the evidence was to become available...
I think the termination clause is a really important one that's there that should be part and parcel of that. You know, for example, just further evidence, we've not submitted it here, but, you know, well, we're submitted now. We believe that our Executive Council member, a man called David Brockett, is getting blacklisted from the Southern General project with Mercury. And we'll pursue that and obviously keep you up. But that's current right now. That's what's happening there. So the get-out clause, you know, the termination point, I think is a really key point.
Now, could I put on record my membership of Unite the Union and participated in the debate in the Chamber, the initiative by Neil Finlay on the blacklisting issue. And my historic trade union membership has brought me into contact with people who have alleged that they were blacklisted. And I'm going to throw this open to the panel. While we've heard much from regarding employers, one of the allegations that was made in the 70s to me in the early 80s was that some trade unions were actively involved in blacklisting individuals because of their activities, either political or trade union activities, which was seen to be detrimental to some of the leadership of the unions at that time that existed. The unions that I'm referring to particularly is no longer in existence, has been amalgamated in so many times, it's now in one of the larger unions. Would you want to comment on your own trade union members' activities in relation to blacklisting? Because I think if we're going to open this up, we need to be honest with ourselves, and we need to be honest about the activities of some union activists or union members in relation to blacklisting fellow workers.
Respond. And you know, as you rightly say, or pointed out there, the unions have merged over the years and creating, you know, Unite, my own union, Unite, is a combination of other sister trade unions over the years making part of that. So Unite in itself was only created in 2007. We're very, very young at this particular time. But in the sense of as our officials of the trade union being involved in any of this, we'll have looked at and investigated some of this, and will continue to investigate. And if we find that there's any evidence of anything like that, we will deal with that in the appropriate manner, as you would expect. We do not believe and would not tolerate in any way, shape or form that type of practice taking place within Unite.
I think the interesting part about that is, from a trade union perspective, there is a willingness to engage in that process and public inquiry or whatever else, and take the appropriate steps should it be proven that there has been any action by any trade union officials in any event. And I think that's the difference, where there is a willingness and an openness to do so, which we're not meeting coming in the opposite direction. I think that's some of the difficulties we have.
Question is should it be proven? And it's not just extend this now out to employers, because one of the difficulties that we have, and I think Harry Frew mentioned the issue about the role of the Economic League. We know the role of the Consulting Association in relation to what the information that ICO was able to pull together, because clearly when Ian Davidson MP came to the Scottish Parliament and did a session with interested MSPs, Ian Davidson clearly highlighted what the ICO found was limited records. And the cases that we have in front of us at the present moment, the 3,213 cases, are only the cases that we could actually get records at the Consulting Association. And clearly there was the allegation was made that a number of other records or a number of other areas where records could have been kept were not available or had not been disappeared in some way, almost Enron-like, to make sure that that information was no longer available. So are we talking about only 3,213 cases, or are we talking about a much wider practice of blacklisting within other industries, not just the construction industry, but also in, for instance, engineering or HR, as one person intimated to me during the lead up to the debate in the Parliament, where they felt they had been blacklisted and were advised not to apply for a job in personnel because they wouldn't get one.
Is that we really don't know, as you'd quite rightly said, that when the Information Commissioners raided the offices of the Consultant Association, they took certain information and there was far more left behind. That additional information, had it been procured at that point in time, may well have led to an expansion of where we are. So, I mean, I know that Neil had indicated earlier on that certainly this could go beyond and out with construction. We just don't know, we don't have the detail. What we do know is we have proof at this moment in time of this number. Does it extend further? May well come out. And again, one of the reasons for a public inquiry would be to open it up to that discussion and engage and involve a wider group of people where we might find that some of these human rights abuses, as has already been said by Pat earlier on, may well be wider. Hopefully that wouldn't be the case, but the reality is that we just do not know. Are we scraping the tip of the iceberg at the moment? We don't know.
Just to follow up, sorry, Convener, the issue about the activities people have been engaged in just in terms of human rights abuses, my understanding is that 4 of these areas are political activities, trade union activities, health and safety issues, and environmental activities. Would you agree that they would be the 4 main areas which may have led to individuals having been blacklisted by either the Consulting Association or by employers?
And if we listened to the Panorama programme last night, it was certainly quite clear that Ian Kerr spent most of his days going through left-wing magazines or reports in the press or anything, collating any small piece of information he could on individuals that was then passed to the employers, whether that be political. I mean, the fact is that health and safety representatives carrying out their legal function in representing their members in a workplace, in a construction industry where deaths and fatalities have been terrible, these people being blacklisted for protecting their own members and trying to get safe working conditions is just completely unacceptable.
Follow to that, I mean, there was, I understand, 3 lists available at the consulting agency, one being construction, the other being oil and gas and petrochemical, and the other being environmental. The environmental was on issues like the building of the M77, where people were climbing up into trees. Their names were on the same list. So, there was 3, but there was a possibility that there was other information there which was destroyed or taken away before we managed to get a hold of the construction files. and these people here, the 3,000 and odd people, would be predominantly for the construction file. there would have been others from, you know, different other files that was there, and other ones that was hidden or destroyed.
Thank you.
Amit Taggart.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. And firstly, declare an interest to Unite, as a member of Unite the Union and Community the Union, and spoken in the blacklisting debate, and hold particularly strong views that comrades have obviously been disadvantaged throughout their working career as much as they have been. But Convener, I actually don't see any other. We spoke about the procurement bill and about how that we could affect that, but I think it calls for, and I know I'm not the one that makes that kind of decision, but for a public inquiry to ensure that all the questions that are being asked around the table are answered, to enable us then to move forward to influence the procurement bill and do that with positivity and have the clear evidence that evidence is still there.
Certainly, I think one of the issues and questions should be, you know, are you prepared to work in partnership with the trade unions through your procurement? That may address, you know, issues for the future. But, you know, the lip service sometimes that goes along with that doesn't really, you know, form a reality what actually happens.
One of the interesting issues in this could be the fact that if the employers, these 44 major construction companies, held their hands up, admitted wrongdoing, compensated the individuals, made an apology for all the wrongdoing for these people, that would be a public statement which would go a long, long way to addressing it, and to ensure that along with that meant the issue that there would be no further recurrences of blacklisting in any sector of the economy ever again would be a step in the right direction.
For that, Chick Brodie, you had a quick point?
Yeah, I don't think that'll ever happen, right? No matter what happens now. And as Terry Fu said, people would only pay lip service, not unless we legislate it properly. Can I just ask one brief question? Have you seen any of the files? With any of the 3,213, have you actually seen them?
Well, I mean, all I can say is I've seen that GMB have had access to the files, as would other people probably in other unions, but personally no. But we do know that contained within these files, and listening to Dave Smith at our Congress in Plymouth last week, it was quite clear that what they have is the national insurance numbers, the date of birth, photos of the family, the car he drives, his safety rep credentials, information on his wife and his brother, when he complained about asbestos and toilets and all. They've got all that detail. We can actually tell you what employer put whose name on the list.
You haven't seen the files?
It's there. It is available.
You haven't seen the files?
I've not seen it.
It's not to say that the unions in general have not seen the files. You're just asking us personally. Have I personally seen the files? No.
No, I'm just saying in terms of public inquiry,
Unite will have seen the files.
It'd be important to have evidence. I hate to use this phrase against, but to have clinical evidence.
70 cases are going to the High Court and have been lodged in the High Court last week, so clearly that evidence will come out.
Thank you.
I mean, the information, Mr Nelson, that you've raised in terms of what was in the file, that would be the type of information that the police, security services or private investigators would use. I'm not suggesting these were the groups that accumulated that information, but that is very intensive and intrusive information. Is there any suggestion, and I don't want to develop your petition to another level, but you'll know this week in the Commons there was a statement about information being passed from, allegedly from GCHQ to America Security Services. Is there any suggestion that mobile phones have been monitored at all as part of this blacklisting?
Really, we don't know at this term, and certainly I'm not linking it to PRISM in terms of what you're talking about in terms of that. But the issue there in terms of security services and the links was leading to the issue about the environmental activists, in particular why all these women found that they were mentioned on a blacklist. You know, that was links towards that. So there is concerns. Has there been collusion? Has there been involvement? Security services. There's a great deal of thought that there may well have been, but at present, without a public inquiry, you can speculate all you want, but you don't have access to the detail.
I think Neil Findlay wanted it.
It's just to pick up on a few points that have been raised. I mean, I haven't seen the large file, but I've certainly had sight of individuals' extracts from the files, and if you look on the Scottish Affairs Select Committee report, at the very end of the report there is extensive extracts from individuals' files. The people are not named, but it's a fascinating read. For example, on one person's file it says he may not be a communist but his father was. You know, he may not have robbed the house, but his dad robbed the house, kind of thing, if you like. On others, it says things. One is Mr. X is suspected to be the twin of someone else. You know, I never knew that being a twin was an offence. You know, so and so is suspected to be a member of the Green Party. The one that I have in one of them that I have in my office says Mr. So and so attended a meeting in Dundee Labour Club. Now, I appreciate some people round the table might think that attending a meeting in Dundee Labour Club is a crime, but I personally don't. However, I mean, the extracts, some of them are bizarre to say the least, and I would encourage people to read the end of that report. Just a couple of things. In terms of the contract procurement stuff, I think that is very, very important, and Harry Frew picked up on that. If, for example, there was a line in the contract that says, have you treated employees unfairly for X, Y, or Z, and the contractor says no, and they have already been listed on the Consultant Association database, then they're lying and they should be in breach of contract. So therefore there's a motivation for them to say yes, and if they say yes, to then apologise, to pay compensation and to get their house in order. So I think going down that route does capture quite a number of these major companies who are taking huge amounts of money from the system.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious of our time, although I think we're all finding it a very interesting and very informative session. So again, to thank our witnesses for that. Do any members have very quick points that haven't been covered? So our next point obviously is looking where we go with this petition. Clearly it's a very important petition, and I would certainly encourage members to agree that we write to Scottish Government asking if they support the terms of that, and obviously within that there's the public inquiry suggestion, and I would have thought going to the Scottish Building Federation would be sensible as well. But John Wilson, do you have any other suggestions? Yeah,
I've got a number of other suggestions, Convener. Could I suggest we would also write to CBI Scotland, the SDUC, ICO, COSLA, and the reason for writing to COSLA, Convener, is because there are a number of local authorities who have actually entered into joint contracts with some of the companies, particularly some of the companies that have been named in the Crossrail case in terms of blacklisting, and write to Construction Scotland.
Thank you for that. Do members have it? Sorry, Mr. Frew.
I heard you mention maybe a good opportunity to involve Scottish Building. I think where you'll find most of these contractors will be in the major contractors group. That's the organisation you need to contact.
Right. Thank you. Neil Finlay?
The Cabinet Secretary, or the Minister, sorry, who replied in the debate, and the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure has also said that the Scottish Government is interested in speaking to interested members about the procurement process. I have written to the Government about that a few weeks back, and I've not heard anything back. Maybe when you're writing to them, if you can maybe ask when that engagement will happen.
Will do. Do members have any other suggestions that haven't been currently covered? Well, as I said, I think this was an excellent session today. Your information, the three of you have given us, have been very, very useful indeed. As I think you'll note that the committee is very enthusiastic to pursue your petition, and obviously we'll keep you up to date with developments and let you know how things are going. Can I thank the three of you again for coming along? It was very good to see you all again, and I'll suspend. We'll go into private session just after this, but I'll allow a few moments for the gallery to clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.